A different foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday, but the essay, the way all life-altering documents do, without ceremony, without warning, slipped beneath the apartment door while Maya Calloway was 3 miles away scrubbing industrial grease from the kitchen floor of Hector's Diner for $9.40 an hour. She found it when she came home at 11:15, still wearing her apron, still smelling of fryer oil and burnt coffee, and the particular hopelessness that clings to people who work themselves to exhaustion and still cannot outrun their debts. Lucas was asleep. She could hear his breathing through the thin wall separating the only bedroom from the pull-out couch she had slept on for the past 14 months, ever since the car broke down and she had made the quiet, devastating decision that her 13-year-old son deserved the real bed more than she did. She stood in the narrow hallway holding the envelope with the bank's return address pressed into the upper left corner, and she did not open it for a long time. She already knew what it said. She had been knowing what it said for 6 weeks. The way you know a storm is coming before the clouds arrive, when the air changes and the birds go quiet, and your bones understand the language of approaching disaster even when your mind refuses to translate. The mortgage on this apartment did not belong to her. It belonged to her mother, Sandra Calloway, who had co-signed the lease 3 years ago when Maya was still technically employed at the medical billing company on 7th Street, and the numbers had seemed, if not comfortable, then at least manageable. Sandra was gone now. Heart attack at 57, which was not supposed to happen to someone who walked 2 miles every morning and took her blood pressure medication without fail. The bank did not care about any of that. The bank cared about 4 months of missed payments and the accumulated interest that had transformed a manageable arrears into a number that made Maya's vision blur when she looked at it directly. She sat down on the pull-out couch in the dark and opened the envelope anyway. 90 days. That was what they were giving her. 90 days to produce $11,422.17, or vacate the premises. She read the figure 3 times. She had $214 in checking, a balance she checked every morning the way some people check the weather, bracing for conditions she had no power to change. She worked 3 jobs. That was the thing nobody seemed to fully absorb when she tried to explain her situation. 3 jobs. The diner from 5 to 2, Tuesday through Saturday. The night cleaning rotation at the Fenwick Office Plaza from 9 to midnight, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And the weekend shift at an Amazon fulfillment center on the east side of the city, where she stood for 10 hours lifting packages that averaged 15 pounds each and was discouraged from taking bathroom breaks longer than 4 minutes. She tracked her hours on a notepad she kept in her apron pocket. Last week, she had worked 81 hours. The week before, 77. She brought home approximately $2,600 a month after taxes, which sounded like a reasonable amount of money until you divided it by rent, utilities, Lucas's school fees, groceries, and the minimum payments on the medical debt left over from the appendix surgery 3 years ago that had cost her more money than she could comprehend and that she had been paying down at $45 a month ever since, which the collections agent cheerfully informed her meant she would finish paying in approximately 22 years. The math never worked. She had tried every variation. She had made spreadsheets. She had used 3 different budgeting apps. She had cut everything down to what should have been nothing, and still, every month, the numbers defeated her by $300, $400, sometimes $600. The deficit was alive. It grew. It metastasized. Outside the window, the city hummed with its indifferent midnight energy. Somewhere in the building above her, someone was having a party. Music filtered through the ceiling like water finding cracks. Lucas slept through it because Lucas could sleep through anything, which was a skill he had developed early and which Maya understood was an adaptation. A child's body learning to switch off when the ambient tension of a household under pressure became too much to hold in conscious awareness. She set the foreclosure notice on the coffee table. She looked at the water stain on the ceiling that she had reported to the property management company 6 times and which had never been repaired. She thought about the wooden horse figurine her son had painted in art class and placed on her nightstand, because he understood even at 13 that she needed something beautiful to look at, and about the permission slip for the 8th grade science competition that she had found in his backpack 2 weeks ago and signed, the entry fee $55 that he had never asked her about because he already knew the answer. She was so tired that the exhaustion had moved beyond ordinary fatigue into a different register entirely, something closer to an existential condition, a permanent state of having given more than she had and continuing to give anyway, because the alternative was unthinkable. She did not sleep that night. She lay on the pull-out couch doing the arithmetic of her survival again and again while the party upstairs wound down and the city grew quieter and the darkness outside the windows softened toward the gray of early morning. When Lucas appeared in the doorway at 6:15, still half asleep with his hair standing at an angle, he saw the look on her face and said nothing. Just went to the kitchen and made coffee, because he knew how to read her silence the way children of struggling single parents always learn to, developing an emotional fluency that adults in easier circumstances never need to acquire. She was at the diner at 5. She smiled at customers. She called everyone honey and refilled coffee before they asked and split her tips with the busboy even when the take was thin, because her mother had taught her that generosity toward people who have less than you is one of the few things that cannot be taken away. At 11:47 that morning, her phone rang with a number she did not recognize, area code she did not know. She almost did not answer. She almost let it go to voicemail the way she did with numbers she did not recognize, which were almost always debt collectors calling from different lines to circumvent her call blocking. Something made her pick up. The voice on the other end was calm and measured and professional in the way of people who deliver significant news regularly and have learned that neutrality serves better than emotion. Is this Maya Calloway, daughter of the late Sandra Calloway, niece of Harold Rutherford? She had not heard her great-uncle's name spoken aloud in over 6 years. Harold Rutherford was her mother's uncle, which made him Maya's great-uncle, which was a relationship so peripheral that she had spent most of her life barely aware it existed. He was 89 years old, as far as she knew. He lived alone in a house outside a small city called Dunmore, approximately 240 miles from where Maya was standing with a phone pressed against her ear and a coffee pot growing heavy in her hand. He was a man she had met perhaps 4 times in her life. A man of remarkable silence, the kind of person who occupied space without filling it, who seemed to observe rather than participate, whose eyes held the quality of someone cataloging details that everyone else was missing. Yes, she said. That's me. The attorney paused for one breath, the way people do before sentences that divide time into before and after. Mr. Harold Rutherford passed away 6 days ago at the age of 91. You have been named in his will. We would like you to attend the estate reading this Thursday at our offices in Dunmore. She stood in the middle of Hector's diner with the coffee pot in her hand and the sound of the grill and the low morning chatter of customers all around her, and she felt the ground shift in some way she could not name. Not because she expected anything. Harold Rutherford was, as far as she knew, a man of modest means who had never married and had lived alone in the same house for 50 years and had left behind no particular evidence of wealth beyond the stubbornness required to survive 9 decades mostly on one's own terms. But he had named her in the will. That had to mean something. She told her manager she had a family emergency. She rode the bus home and looked up Harold Rutherford on her phone, finding almost nothing. A brief obituary in the Dunmore Courier, 8 lines long. 91. Longtime resident. No survivors listed by name. Only the phrase survived by several nieces and nephews, which told her that the inheritance reading would not be a small gathering of one. There would be others. There were always others. She was right. The law offices of Raymond Oaks occupied the ground floor of a building on Dunmore's Main Street that smelled of old carpet and wood polish, the particular atmosphere of establishments that do not need to advertise because their clientele arrives by reputation and necessity rather than marketing. When Maya arrived on Thursday morning after a 4-hour bus ride that had cost her $38 she could not spare, she found 7 people already seated in the conference room, and not one of them looked at her the way people look at someone they are glad to see. They were the Rutherford side of the family. Cousins, second cousins, a man who introduced himself as Harold's brother's son, which made him a cousin of some remove that Maya lacked the genealogical vocabulary to specify. They were, as a group, prosperous in the specific way of people who have always been prosperous and have never seriously considered the possibility of being otherwise. Good coats, confident posture, the particular ease of people for whom money is background noise rather than a constant foreground emergency. The woman who commanded the room without appearing to try was named Brenda. She was 48, which she wore like an investment portfolio, everything carefully maintained and precisely positioned. Her husband Derek sat beside her in a suit that probably cost more than Maya's monthly income, and he had the practiced smile of a man in commercial real estate, which he was, and which he had mentioned within 40 seconds of being introduced, the information delivered with the casual certainty of someone who expects it to rearrange the conversational hierarchy in his favor. Brenda had been the family's closest connection to Harold in recent years. She mentioned this several times before the attorney even opened his folder. She had visited Harold at least twice a year. She had managed his prescriptions during his illness. She had arranged the funeral, which had been, she indicated, tasteful but appropriately modest given Harold's known preferences for simplicity. Maya sat near the back of the room and said very little. Lucas was at school. The bus had been 40 minutes late. She had a 3-hour window before she needed to catch the return route and be back in the city in time for her 9 o'clock cleaning shift. She had brought a sandwich in a Ziploc bag because she could not afford to buy lunch in Dunmore, and she ate it quietly in the parking lot before going in because she understood instinctively that producing food from a Ziploc bag in a law office conference room would confirm the unspoken assessments already being made about her. Raymond Oakes was in his late 60s, a deliberate man who read the will with the measured cadence of someone who understood that he was managing expectations as much as conveying information. Harold Rutherford had not been, it emerged, a man of modest means in the way anyone had assumed. The house was worth approximately $310,000 in current market conditions. The property it sat on, for acres at the edge of the county, had development potential that Derek, leaning forward in his chair, immediately began to calculate audibly until Brenda put her hand on his arm. The bank accounts, modest savings and a pension accumulated over 41 years as a machinist at the Dunmore Metal Works, totaled $92,000. There was a collection of tools, hand tools mostly, in the garage that a local appraiser had estimated at approximately $8,000. There was furniture, much of it antique and quite good, which Brenda had already had appraised before the reading, a fact she disclosed with the calm certainty of someone who does not expect to be questioned. The distribution was detailed. The house went to Brenda. The bank accounts divided among Harold's 3 surviving nieces and nephews in equal thirds, which gave each of them approximately $30,000. The furniture distributed according to a handwritten list Harold had prepared, most of it directed toward family members Maya had never met. The tools went to Harold's longtime neighbor, a man named Gerald Watts, with a note attached to the bequest that read, in Harold's cramped handwriting, simply for all the mornings. Maya's name came near the bottom of the document. She heard it and straightened in her chair. To my great-niece Maya Calloway, I leave the icebox. Silence, and then Brenda laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of someone who finds a situation genuinely absurd rather than deliberately offensive, which is sometimes worse. The icebox, she repeated, mostly to Derek. Harold, and that ridiculous icebox. Raymond Oakes. Continued reading, because wills do not pause for reactions. The item in question, he clarified, was a commercial-grade Kelvinator freezer unit manufactured approximately in 1941, located in the basement of the Dunmore property, which was now, of course, Brenda's property. The unit had not been operational for decades. It was, Raymond said carefully, choosing the word with the precision of a man who has learned to be exact about these things, significant. Significant, Derek repeated, drawing the word out. As in, significantly large and significantly worthless. More laughter, softer now, from the people along the walls. Someone murmured something about old Harold and his eccentricities. Maya said nothing. She was looking at the phrase in the will. To my great-niece Maya Calloway, I leave the icebox. Harold had written her name. Of all the things in that house, in that estate, in 91 years of living, he had written her name next to one specific object. Not a painting, not a chair, not a sum of money. The icebox. She thought about the 4 times she had met Harold Rutherford. Once at her mother's wedding when Maya was 6, which she remembered in the distorted way of early childhood, mostly colors and sounds. Once at a family reunion when she was 15, where Harold had sat at the edge of the gathering and watched people with those measuring eyes and had spoken to her directly for the first time, asking what she was reading, and when she said she was reading nothing because she had forgotten to bring a book, had gone to his car and returned with a copy of a book about mechanical engineering that she had not understood, but had read anyway, because he had handed it to her with such quiet intention. Once at her mother's funeral, where he had arrived alone and left without speaking to anyone except Maya, to whom he had said only, "Your mother was the finest person this family produced." And once, the strangest visit, when she was 26 and Lucas was 2 and Harold had driven himself to her apartment, for hours by car, unannounced, on a Wednesday afternoon, and had sat in her kitchen drinking tea and looking around with those cataloging eyes, and had said, before leaving, "You are going to be all right." She had not believed him. She had understood him to be offering the kind of comfort older people offer younger people, because they cannot offer money. Now she was 32. She was not all right. And Harold had left her the icebox. Brenda was already organizing. The house would need to be cleared within 60 days, she announced to the room with the authority of a woman who has claimed a narrative and intends to maintain it. She would need access to arrange proper disposal of any items not claimed by beneficiaries. Anyone who wanted to collect their bequests should coordinate with her directly. Her card was on the table. She distributed them. She did not give Maya a card. Maya had to ask. After the reading, in the parking lot, Derek appeared beside Maya's car, which was not her car, but the neighbor's car she had borrowed for the occasion because the bus schedule to Dunmore would not have gotten her back in time for her cleaning shift. "Look," he said, and his tone was the tone of a man offering charity while presenting it as logic. "That icebox is worth nothing. I looked it up. Old Kelvinator commercial units, even working ones, sell for maybe a few $100s at auction. Yours hasn't worked in 40 years. If you're planning to transport it, the removal alone will cost you more than it's worth." He paused, letting the math land. "I'll give you $300 for it. Right now? Cash. Saves you the trip back out here. Saves you the removal cost." Maya looked at him for a moment. He had the expression of someone offering a favor that also, conveniently, benefits him significantly. "Why?" she said. He blinked. "Excuse me? Why do you want it?" she asked, "if it's worth nothing." His smile returned, but had gone slightly thin at the edges. "I don't, particularly. I'm trying to help you avoid an inconvenient trip." She thanked him and got in the borrowed car and drove 4 blocks before pulling over because her hands were shaking and she needed a moment in which nothing was required of her. She sat there for 7 minutes, which she could not afford. Then she drove back to the city, worked her cleaning shift, and lay awake on the pull-out couch in the dark thinking about Harold Rutherford's eyes and the word significant and the fact that Derek had offered her $300 for something that was, by his own accounting, worth nothing. She went back to Dunmore 11 days later. She had arranged with Brenda, through 3 telephone exchanges of increasing awkwardness, to access the basement of the property to evaluate her bequest. She brought Lucas. She had told him they were taking a trip, which was technically true, and he had accepted this with the equanimity of a teenager who has learned that his mother operates on schedules and logistical realities that do not always accommodate full explanations in advance. The house surprised her. She had expected modest and found something closer to layered, the accumulated evidence of a man who had lived deliberately, who had arranged his life around function and quality and the particular beauty of things that work well. The furniture was good, the kind of furniture that had been made to last and had fulfilled that promise. Tools hung in the garage on custom brackets, organized by type and size, every surface clean. Books in the living room, serious books, engineering manuals and histories, and a full collection of someone named Wendell Berry whose name Maya did not recognize, but whose presence in such quantity on Harold's shelves suggested significance. Lucas ran his hand along the workbench in the garage with something approaching reverence. He was interested in how things were made. He had been taking apart and reassembling electronics since he was 8. "Your great-uncle made things," he said. It was an observation more than a question. "Yes," Maya said, though she was not sure she had known this consciously before. The basement stairs were accessed through a door off the kitchen, solid wood, well hung, with a heavy latch that lifted cleanly. Harold had maintained his house the way he had maintained his tools, which was to say with the steady attention of someone who understood that things properly cared for reveal their quality over time. The stairs were sound. The handrail was solid. The light at the bottom worked on a string pull that Lucas found and engaged. The icebox occupied the far wall. Maya stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at it for a long time without speaking. She had expected, based on the dismissive reaction in the conference room, something small and rusted and obviously without value, a relic that had been allowed to deteriorate into pure sentiment. What she found instead was enormous. The unit stood 6.5 feet tall, perhaps 5 feet wide and 4 feet deep. A rectangular monolith of white enamel and industrial steel that had been manufactured in a time when things were built to outlast the people who used them. It was a commercial-grade unit, the kind that had once occupied the back rooms of hotels or restaurant kitchens, not a household appliance. The enamel had yellowed at the seams over the decades, but had not cracked or chipped. The door hinges were original and appeared to be in extraordinary condition for their age. The latch mechanism on the main door was heavy steel, the kind of hardware you do not encounter in modern appliances, the kind made by people who thought of a refrigerator as serious machinery. "Mom," Lucas said from behind her, his voice carrying that particular mix of teenager's irony and genuine interest that she had learned to decode. "That thing is massive." "It is," she agreed. She walked toward it. The basement smelled of old concrete and dry wood, and the faint mineral trace of old appliances. But underneath everything, something else, something she could not identify, but that registered as deliberate rather than incidental. Like a smell that someone had considered. She filed it away. The main door of the icebox swung open with surprising ease, the hinges obviously lubricated relatively recently, within years rather than decades. Inside, the unit was empty and clean, the interior surfaces white enamel unblemished by rust or mold, which was notable given the age. The interior dimensions appeared to be approximately 4 feet wide by 3 feet deep. There were 2 wire shelves still in place, their chrome only lightly oxidized. Lucas climbed halfway into the interior to examine the construction, his flashlight app illuminating corners. "This is an incredible shape," he said. "How?" She did not answer because she was doing something her warehouse floor instincts, developed over 14 months of inventory work at the fulfillment center, had prompted her to do without conscious decision. She was measuring, not with a tape measure, which she had not brought, but with her eyes and her hands, and the spatial reasoning that came from years of calculating how many units fit in a space, how much volume a box occupies, whether a shelf would hold the weight being asked of it. She walked the length of the icebox. She walked the width. Then she walked outside to look at the unit from behind. She stood there for 30 seconds with her hand resting against the exterior wall at the back of the unit. Lucas appeared beside her. "You okay?" "The exterior back wall is deeper than the interior," she said. He looked at her, then at the icebox. "What do you mean?" She went back inside and counted the paces between the stairs and the icebox. For paces. She counted the paces between the back wall of the icebox and the basement wall behind it. 2 paces. Then she went to the exterior of the house and stood against the back wall and paced the distance to the point where she calculated the back of the icebox was located. She did not have the measuring tools to be precise, but the spatial math was clear. The icebox sat against the basement wall. The basement wall sat against the exterior wall of the house. There was no meaningful space between, which meant the depth of the icebox's interior and the depth of the icebox's exterior should be roughly equal, accounting for wall thickness and insulation. Standard commercial refrigeration units of this era had insulation walls approximately 4 inches thick. The exterior of this unit appeared to be approximately 5 feet deep. The interior, as she had measured by reach, appeared to be approximately 3 feet deep. That was 24 inches of unaccounted space. Lucas, who had been following her calculations with growing attention, spoke quietly. "You think there's something in the walls?" She did not answer immediately because she was still working through the implications, still holding the spatial arithmetic against other data points, Harold's eyes, and the word significant, and Derek's immediate desire to own something he had simultaneously dismissed as worthless. She pressed her palms flat against the back exterior wall of the icebox. The enamel was cold under her hands. She moved her hands slowly, feeling for variation. The surface was smooth, uniformly smooth, until approximately 14 inches from the bottom right corner where her fingers registered something. Not a seam exactly, but a difference. A subtle change in the quality of the surface. She pressed. Nothing happened. She moved her hands left, 6 inches, and pressed again. And this time something shifted inside the wall, a mechanism she could not see but could feel transmitting through the enamel, something releasing. Lucas made a sound. They both stood very still. A section of the exterior back wall, approximately 18 inches wide and 4 feet tall, had moved outward a fraction of an inch, the suggestion of a door concealed behind the surface of the icebox exterior. Maya looked at her son. He looked back at her with an expression she recognized because she had seen it in the mirror sometimes. The face of someone who has been surviving on diminished expectations for long enough that the sudden appearance of possibility feels almost dangerous, as though engaging with hope requires a courage she has spent years carefully managing. She put her fingers in the hairline gap and pulled gently. The hidden panel swung open on hinges, so well-maintained they made no sound. Inside the space between the outer wall and the inner wall of the icebox, revealed in the beam of Lucas's phone flashlight, was shelving. Shelving built from heavy timber, dark with age, running the full height and width of the concealed space. And on the shelves, arranged with the same quiet order that characterized every other system Harold Rutherford had designed and maintained across 9 decades of deliberate living, were bars. She counted them before her mind would name what they were. 1, 2, 3 across, 5 rows high on this section, and the shelving ran the full depth of the concealed space, which meant there were more behind. Rectangular. Identical dimensions. A warm color in the flashlight beam that had nothing to do with the ambient light and everything to do with the material itself. Lucas's hand found her arm. He gripped it hard, not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to communicate something neither of them had words for yet. Mom. She knew. She reached out and picked up the nearest bar with both hands. The weight hit her before the significance did. The weight was extraordinary, the kind of weight that remaps your expectations of what an object that size should be allowed to weigh. Dense in a way that was categorically different from dense metal or dense wood. Dense in the way of a specific thing, a thing she had never held before, but whose weight she recognized the way you recognize a truth that has been approaching from a distance. She turned it over in her hands. The surface was smooth, warm despite the basement temperature, marked with a series of stamps she could not read clearly in the flashlight beam. Numbers. Letters. A small symbol she could not identify. She looked at her son. He was crying. He had not realized it until she looked at him, and then he noticed, touching his face with his free hand with mild surprise, as though the tears had arrived ahead of his comprehension. "Is that what I think it is?" he whispered. She placed the bar back on the shelf with extraordinary care. She closed the panel until the mechanism re-engaged. She stood in the basement of Harold Rutherford's house in Dunmore and felt the ground shift beneath her again, but differently this time. Not the lurching displacement of a foreclosure notice or an eviction date, but something closer to tectonic, something happening at a depth below ordinary experience, rearranging the geological structure of what was possible. She had her phone out. She was searching. She found dimensions and weight specifications for standard gold bullion bars, the kind produced by accredited refineries, the kind that showed up in vaults and institutional holdings, and the carefully maintained inventories of people who had understood for decades that the paper systems of money are provisional in ways that metal is not. Standard gold bar, London good delivery specification. Approximately 10 inches long. Approximately 3.5 inches wide. Approximately 1.75 inches thick. Weight approximately 400 troy ounces, or approximately 27.5 pounds. She stared at the screen. She looked at the panel. She looked at her son. She could see approximately 15 bars in the first visible row. She had no way yet to know how deep the shelving ran, how far back into the concealed space the arrangement extended. But she could do the beginning of the arithmetic even with partial information. And the beginning of the arithmetic was already producing numbers that her brain rejected as incompatible with the circumstances of her life. "We need to sit down," she said. They sat on the basement stairs. The concrete was cold and the light was not quite enough, and Maya Calloway was shaking, a fine tremor running through her hands and her arms, and somewhere deeper than that, some structural level of herself she was not accustomed to feeling, as though her body understood before her mind caught up that the world had changed. Lucas sat beside her with his shoulder against hers and said nothing for a long time. Outside, through the small basement window near the ceiling, she could see the winter light shifting. It was almost 2 o'clock. "We need to think carefully," she said, when she trusted her voice again. He nodded. He was watching her with an intensity that reminded her of every moment in his life, when he had looked to her to navigate something that neither of them had prepared for, the look that was trust in its most essential form. "We don't tell anyone yet." He nodded again. We need to understand what we have before anyone else knows we have it. He nodded a third time, and she recognized in his silence the particular steadiness of someone who has grown up in conditions that require self-possession, who has learned that panic is a luxury that people without margins cannot afford. She looked back at the panel on the icebox, at the place where the world had rearranged itself behind a seam of enamel. She thought about Harold Rutherford arriving at her apartment on that Wednesday afternoon 7 years ago, sitting in her kitchen, drinking his tea, looking around with those cataloging eyes. She thought about him saying, "You are going to be all right," and driving 4 hours back to Dunmore alone. He had not been offering comfort. He had been telling her something that was going to take 7 years to become true. She needed to understand the legal dimensions of what she had found before she did anything else. The will bequeathed to her the icebox. The icebox contained something within its walls. Whether that something was legally part of the bequest or separately classified depended on language and jurisdiction and the specific terms of how the bequest had been worded, all of which meant she needed an attorney, and she needed one who had no connection to Raymond Oakes or to Brenda or to Derek or to anyone else in this town who already had opinions about the distribution of Harold Rutherford's estate. She needed an attorney she could trust, and she currently had $214 in her checking account. She stood up from the basement stairs and made herself breathe steadily, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the technique she had read about in a library book on managing stress, and which she used in the moments at work when the exhaustion threatened to become something she could not manage back into functionality. "Let's go look at the rest of the house," she told Lucas. He understood. They needed to appear to be doing exactly what anyone would expect a beneficiary to do when visiting a bequest. They needed to be unremarkable. They needed to give away nothing. They spent an hour walking through Harold's house, and as they did, Maya began to see what she had not seen on the surface. A man who had arranged his life around precision and concealment and the patient understanding that some things need to be held in place for a very long time before they become available to the person they were always intended for. She found, in the top drawer of the desk in Harold's study, a sealed envelope with her name on the front in the same cramped handwriting that had appeared on the bequest note in the will. She put it in her jacket pocket without opening it. Not here. Not yet. Upstairs, in what had been Harold's bedroom, Lucas opened the closet and found a shelf of notebooks, a dozen of them, all labeled by year, the earliest dating back to 1962. He pulled one down and flipped through it, then looked at her. "These are like journals," he said. "Engineering notes, machine notes, but also other stuff." She looked over his shoulder. Harold's handwriting was small and deliberate, filling pages with a mixture of technical notation and something closer to observation. She saw, on a page from what appeared to be the mid-1980s, a series of calculations she recognized as weight-to-volume ratios. She saw, on another page, a careful diagram that she could not interpret without context, but that she understood was intentional documentation of something Harold had wanted preserved in record. She took the notebooks, all of them. She placed them carefully in the canvas bag she had brought with her, because she always carried a canvas bag, the habit of someone who is always transporting something between the multiple locations her life required her to occupy simultaneously. On the way out of the house, she passed through the kitchen and stopped. There was a photograph on the refrigerator, held by a magnet from a hardware store, faded at the edges, taken perhaps 30 years ago. It showed Harold standing in the backyard of this house beside an enormous piece of machinery that Maya recognized after a moment as the icebox, newly installed, gleaming. Beside Harold stood another man, roughly the same age, both of them looking at the camera with expressions of controlled satisfaction, the look of people who have accomplished something they are not prepared to celebrate publicly, but which they know is significant. She took a picture of the photograph with her phone. In the car on the way back to the city, Lucas asleep against the window before they had left Dunmore's city limits, Maya drove with both hands on the wheel and the sealed envelope from Harold's desk sitting on the passenger seat, not yet opened, because she had the instinct, not formed from logic, but from the same spatial reasoning that had found the panel on the icebox, that what was inside it needed to be read in conditions she could control. She did not tell Lucas about the envelope. He had enough to hold. The drive was 4 hours in traffic. She thought about Harold Rutherford for all 4 of them. She thought about him leaving her the icebox while the rest of the family collected houses and money and furniture. She thought about Brenda's laugh. She thought about Derek's offer and the way his expression had changed by the smallest amount when she asked him why. She thought about the weight of the bar in her hands, the specific weight of a thing that does not behave the way ordinary objects behave, that makes your body understand before your mind catches up. She did not allow herself to do the full arithmetic yet. She was not ready. She got home at 11. Lucas stumbled to bed. She sat at the kitchen table under the one light that worked in the fixture above, and she opened Harold's envelope. The handwriting was Harold's, cramped and deliberate and entirely without flourish. Maya, if you have found the icebox, you have found the door. If you have found the door, you have found what is inside. If you are reading this letter, it means you have not yet told anyone, which means you have the sense I always believed you had. Your mother was my favorite person in this family, which is not something I was able to say to her while she was living, and for that I hold a regret I will carry until I am finished. You are her daughter in ways that go deeper than resemblance. She was the kind of person who notices the thing no one else notices, who walks into a room and counts the exits, who understands that the world is not arranged the way it presents itself. I spent 41 years working at the Dunmore Metal Works. What I accumulated over those years, I accumulated through patience and restraint and the understanding that paper currency is a collective agreement, which means it is subject to dissolution in the way of all agreements. Metal is not subject to dissolution. Metal holds its value across political arrangements and institutional failures and the various collapses that civilization performs approximately every generation. I have been accumulating since 1961. What you found in the walls of the icebox is what I accumulated across 60 years. I will not write the number. You will find the number in the notebooks, where everything is documented with the precision I applied to all my work. The documentation includes provenance and acquisition records and the name of the independent assayer in Pittsburgh who certified the contents in 2019, whose certification you will also find in the notebooks. Everything is legal. Everything is documented. Everything passes. I chose you because you are the only person in this family who would have found the panel. I knew this when I visited your apartment and looked at how you had organized your kitchen, which you had done according to a system of your own devising that was more efficient than any system I had seen in the kitchens of people who were not mechanics. The rest of them would have sold the icebox to Derek for his $300 and felt clever about it. The bequest, as written, covers the icebox and its contents. Raymond has my original documentation on this point, which he will produce if necessary, though I suggest consulting independent counsel before approaching Raymond, who is not dishonest, but who is Brenda's attorney of long standing and whose loyalties are therefore not entirely yours. There is more I want to tell you about why I waited this long and what I hope you will do with what you have inherited. That is for another letter. Find the notebook labeled 2019. It is the last one on the right shelf. Read it last. You are going to be all right, Maya. I promised you that, and I keep my promises. Harold, she read the letter 3 times. Then she set it on the table and looked at the water stain on the ceiling and breathed. Outside, the city hummed. The party upstairs that had moved in 6 months ago was mercifully quiet for once. Through the wall, she could hear the slow, steady rhythm of her son sleeping, the sound that had organized her life for 13 years, the fixed point around which everything else orbited. She picked up her phone and did the search she had been avoiding. Current gold price per troy ounce. The number that came back was one she recognized from recent news cycles, a historic high, sustained by the particular anxieties of the current moment in global economics. She wrote it down on the corner of Harold's letter. Then she went to the notebooks in the canvas bag and found the one labeled 2019 and set it aside. She went to the earliest notebook, 1962, and opened it to the first page. She read for 6 hours straight. Harold Rutherford had begun purchasing gold in 1961, the year he turned 31, the year he concluded, based on the evidence of monetary policy changes he had been tracking since 1955, that the Bretton Woods system was in terminal decline and that the decoupling of the dollar from gold would arrive within a decade. He had been correct. He had not been lucky. He had been right in the way of people who pay attention to systems and understand how they fail. He had purchased gold bullion, always from certified refiners, always in amounts that remained beneath the reporting thresholds of their respective eras, not to evade taxation, which he had paid in full at every point and which was documented, but simply because he preferred to operate quietly. He had purchased bars of varying sizes over the decades. The larger London good delivery bars as his accumulation grew, the smaller kilogram bars in the earlier years. He had documented every acquisition with the specificity of a machinist who understood that records protect against every form of chaos. By 1985, he had accumulated what the notebooks documented as 83 bars of varying specifications. By 2000, 147. By 2010, 209. By 2019, when the independent assayer from Pittsburgh had made his visit and produced his certification, Harold Rutherford's Icebox contained what the notebooks described as 264 bars across 3 categories of specification: the acquisition cost documented for each one, the weight documented for each one, the serial numbers and refinery marks documented for each one. She sat with the notebook open in her hands and did the arithmetic. 264 bars. The average weight across the mix of specifications Harold had documented was approximately 290 troy ounces per bar. 264 bars at 290 troy ounces each was approximately 76,560 troy ounces. At the current price per troy ounce, she wrote the final number on the corner of Harold's letter. She looked at it for a long time. $327 million. She looked at the foreclosure notice on the coffee table with its 90-day deadline and its $11,422.17. She looked at the water stain on the ceiling. She looked at the Ziploc bag on the counter that still held the bottom third of the sandwich she had packed for the bus ride to Dunmore 11 days ago. Then she set down the notebook, folded Harold's letter carefully, and did something she had not done in longer than she could accurately remember. She allowed herself, in the silence of that kitchen, in the before-dawn darkness of a life that had been organized around surviving rather than having, to simply feel what was happening. It lasted approximately 4 minutes. Then she straightened in her chair, pulled the notebook labeled 2019 from the canvas bag, opened it to the first page, and went back to work. Because Harold Rutherford's great-niece understood something that the people in that conference room did not, and that Derek had never learned in all his years of commercial real estate, and that Brenda had never needed to learn because the world had arranged itself around her requirements from the very beginning. The difference between finding something and keeping it is not luck. It is the work you do in the hours before anyone else knows what you have found. Maya Calloway had never been afraid of work. The notebook labeled 2019 contained, as Harold had indicated, documentation of the assayer's visit and certification, a legal brief prepared by an attorney in Pittsburgh, not Raymond Oakes, covering the question of bequest and contents, and the specific language Harold had required Raymond to include in the will to protect against exactly the challenges she would soon face. And on the final page of the notebook, a second letter. This one was longer. This one told her everything else. She read until the light outside the window shifted from black to the deep blue of before dawn, and by the time Lucas appeared in the doorway at 6:15 with his hair at its customary angle, she had a plan. It was incomplete, and it had dependencies she had not yet resolved, and there were people who were going to try very hard to take from her what Harold had spent 60 years assembling and placing in her path. But she had something they did not. She had Harold's notebooks. She had Harold's documentation. She had Harold's letter, which closed with words she had already memorized. And she had, for the first time in her life, a margin. Use it, he had written. Not for comfort, for leverage. The world respects people who understand that every position is negotiable until it is not, and the moment at which it ceases to be negotiable is the moment you allow someone else to define the terms. Do not allow anyone to define the terms. Lucas came to stand behind her and looked at the notebooks spread across the kitchen table and the handwritten numbers on the corner of Harold's letter. He was quiet for a moment. He was reading. He was very good at reading. He set his hand on her shoulder, and she put her hand over his. "Mom," he said quietly. "Yeah, we're going to need a lawyer." "We are," she agreed. "A good one." "Yes." She looked at the foreclosure notice. She thought about the panel on the icebox and the weight of the bar in her hands, and Harold Rutherford arriving at her apartment on that Wednesday 7 years ago and saying you are going to be all right with the quiet certainty of a man who was not guessing. She reached for her phone. It was time to begin. The attorney's name was Carol Sims, and Maya found her the way she found most things in her life, through persistence applied in the direction of a small opening. She had spent the morning after reading Harold's notebooks calling every legal aid organization in the city, explaining the situation in the compressed, precise terms of someone who has learned to make a case in the time before a person decides to hang up. Most of them listened politely and directed her elsewhere. Two of them said the matter was too complex for their scope. One gave her a referral to a pro bono estate attorney who had not answered her calls in 3 days. Carol Sims she found through the Pittsburgh attorney whose name appeared in Harold's notebook, a retired estate lawyer named Frank Alderman, who had drawn up Harold's legal brief and who answered his phone on the second ring at 7:30 in the morning with the alertness of a man who has always kept early hours and considers this a character trait. When Maya explained who she was and what she had found and what she needed, there was a silence on the line that she had learned to read. Not the silence of disbelief, but the silence of a person recalibrating their assessment of a situation they thought they already understood. "Harold told me about you," Frank said finally. "He said you would call, if and when. He said you would have already read everything before you picked up the phone." She had. He gave her Carol Sims's number and said, without elaboration, that Carol was the best he knew in the specific territory Maya was about to enter, which was the territory where inheritance law, asset protection, and the particular aggression of people who feel entitled to things they did not earn all converged into something that required not just legal knowledge but a certain quality of nerve. Carol Sims was 54, a compact woman with reading glasses she wore pushed up on her head like a second pair of eyes, and she had the manner of someone who has spent 3 decades in rooms where powerful people try to talk over her and has developed a very specific vocabulary for stopping that. She listened to Maya for 22 minutes without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad in handwriting that appeared to be a private shorthand nobody else could decode. When Maya finished, Carol set down her pen and looked at her with an expression that was not sympathy exactly, but something adjacent to it, the look of someone who recognizes the shape of a fight and is deciding whether it is worth having. "The bequest language matters most," Carol said. "If Harold's will uses the phrase the icebox and its contents, you are substantially protected. If it says only the icebox, there is an argument to be made about fixtures versus chattels and whether items concealed within the structure of an appliance constitute part of the appliance or separate property." She paused. "Did you bring the will?" Maya had brought everything. The will, Harold's notebooks, the letter from Harold's desk, the assayer's certification from 2019, Frank Alderman's legal brief. She laid them on Carol's desk in the order in which she had organized them the night before, which was not the order in which she had acquired them, but the order in which they built the most coherent argument, because she had spent the previous evening doing what Harold's letter had told her to do. She had not wasted time on feelings. She had done the work. Carol read through the documents with the focused speed of someone who processes legal language the way other people process their native tongue. When she reached Harold's will and the specific language of the bequest, she stopped and read the sentence twice, then set the page down with a precision that felt like a verdict. "The icebox and all that it contains," Carol said. Harold's language. Specific and deliberate. "He was a machinist," Maya said. "He did not use imprecise language." Carol almost smiled. "No, he did not." She picked up Frank Alderman's brief and turned to the second page. "And Frank has anticipated the counterargument and pre-addressed it. Harold must have spent years setting this up. Since at least 2019, Maya said. Based on the notebooks, he had been thinking about the framework since the late 90s. Carol looked at her over the reading glasses she had now lowered to their operational position. "Maya, I need to ask you something directly. How much time do we have before the family discovers what you found?" She had thought about this on the drive over, running the timeline. Brenda had given 60 days for the house to be cleared. 41 of those days remained. Brenda would not go to the basement immediately. The icebox was not on anyone's list of items worth examining closely. Derek's $300 offer had been opportunistic rather than informed, she believed, based on something he had noticed at the estate reading, something in Harold's demeanor around the item perhaps, or something Raymond Oakes had let slip. But Derek did not know what she knew. Nobody did. 6 weeks, she said. Maybe less if Derek goes back to look at it himself. Then we move in the next 72 hours, Carol said. She was already reaching for her phone. The first thing we do is secure the asset. The second thing we do is authenticate it. The third thing we do is file notice of claim before anyone else can file a competing claim. After that, We let the legal process work. She stopped with the phone in her hand and looked at Maya directly. This will cost money. I will front the initial costs against the value of the estate, contingency arrangement, but the authentication alone, bringing a certified independent assayer to Dunmore, will run between $8,000 and $15,000 depending on the scope required. Maya nodded. She understood how contingency arrangements worked. She had read about them in the library. There is one other thing, Carol said. The moment we file notice of claim, the family will know. There will be no controlling the information after that point. Brenda will hire attorneys. Derek will attempt to intervene. There will very likely be an effort to claim the contents separately from the icebox, to argue that Harold intended the appliance as a sentimental bequest and not as a mechanism for transferring wealth. They will argue anything they can argue because the number we are talking about changes the nature of every motivation in that family overnight. I know, Maya said. I want you to be clear-eyed about what this means, Carol said, and her voice had shifted slightly, dropping the professional register for something more direct. People who have been comfortable their entire lives become capable of remarkable things when they perceive that something they consider theirs is being claimed by someone they consider beneath them. It will not be pleasant. Maya thought about the foreclosure notice on her coffee table. She thought about Lucas's permission slip and signed in his backpack. She thought about 81 hours of work in a single week and still falling short by $400. I have been living unpleasant, she said. I am not afraid of more of it. Carol nodded once, the nod of someone marking a character assessment. Good. Then we begin. The assayer Carol brought from Pittsburgh was a man named Robert Chung, 61, who arrived in Dunmore 2 days later in a rented sedan containing equipment cases whose combined weight and complexity suggested he had prepared for an examination of considerable scope. He wore a practical expression of professional neutrality and shook Maya's hand with the firm brevity of someone whose time is organized around precision rather than social ease. They met at Harold's house on a Thursday morning. Carol present along with a notary Carol had engaged to document every element of the process. Maya had the key to the property, having requested it formally from Raymond Oakes through Carol the previous day, citing her legal right to access the bequeathed item for assessment purposes. Raymond had produced the key without comment, but with an expression that suggested he was already doing calculations of his own. The basement was exactly as Maya had left it. The icebox occupied its wall, monumental and still. Robert Chung walked around it twice before touching anything, his eyes moving with the methodical quality of someone conducting an inventory. Then he said, I need you to show me the access mechanism. She showed him. His expression did not change when the panel opened. He had been told what to expect. He had chosen not to form opinions before seeing evidence, which was, he explained, the professional standard. He spent 4 hours in that basement. He removed each bar individually, weighted on a calibrated portable scale, measured its dimensions with calipers, examined the surface stampings under a loupe, ran a non-destructive XRF analysis to verify elemental composition, and recorded every finding in a tablet that was simultaneously uploading to a secured server Carol had arranged. He did not rush. He did not comment on what he was finding. He worked with the same quality of attention that Harold's notebooks had demonstrated, the focused patience of someone who understands that thoroughness is not an option but a requirement. Maya sat on the basement stairs and watched him work and did not speak unless spoken to. Lucas was at school. She had told him only that she was handling things, which was true, and that he should focus on his schoolwork, which he did because he understood that some portions of adult operations required space to function. When Robert Chung finished, he stood in the center of the basement and looked at his tablet for a long moment before speaking. 267 bars, he said. 3 more than your documentation indicated. Harold appears to have made 3 additional acquisitions after the 2019 certification and not updated the notebooks. All bars are confirmed genuine. Composition consistent with high-purity investment-grade bullion across 3 standard specifications. Stampings verified against registered refinery records. He looked at Maya over the tablet. Certified value at current market pricing comes to $331,400,000, approximately. The small discrepancy from your calculation reflects the 3 additional bars and a minor adjustment for current spot price. The notary was writing. Carol was watching Maya with the expression of someone waiting to see how a person absorbs a number that rearranges everything they know about their own life. Maya sat very still on the basement stairs. She thought about the 3 bars Harold had added after the certification, 3 additional bars he had quietly acquired in the last years of his life, added to the arrangement without updating the record, the final quiet deposits of a man who had been accumulating with patience and intention for 60 years and had not stopped simply because he was running out of time. She thought about him driving 4 hours to sit in her kitchen and drink tea, about his eyes moving around the apartment, about you are going to be all right. She pressed her palms flat against her knees and said, "Thank you." Robert Chung nodded. He began packing his equipment. Carol filed the notice of claim that afternoon. The document entered the Dunmore County probate record at 3:47 in the afternoon, precisely worded, citing Harold's specific bequest language, attaching the certified assayer's report and Frank Alderman's legal brief, and formally establishing Maya Calloway's legal claim to the contents of the icebox as defined by the will of Harold Rutherford, deceased. By 6 o'clock that evening, Raymond Oakes had called Carol 4 times. By 8 o'clock, Brenda had called Maya directly, which surprised Maya because Brenda did not have her number and the acquisition of it required a specific effort. Maya let it go to voicemail. Brenda's message was long and covered several registers of emotion in quick succession, beginning with confusion, moving through what presented itself as concern but functioned as accusation, arriving finally at an outrage that had clearly been building across the full length of the recording and that Brenda was containing with the imperfect success of someone applying a small bandage to a significant wound. The words scheme and deception appeared. The phrase what Harold clearly intended. The assertion that as the family member who had been closest to Harold in his final years, Brenda was positioned to speak to his actual wishes in a way that any document could not fully capture. Maya listened to the voicemail 3 times. Then she forwarded it to Carol with a brief message that said, "For the record, Derek called at 9:15. He did not leave a voicemail." By the following morning, Brenda had retained attorneys, 3 of them, from a firm in the state capital that specialized in contested estate litigation. Carol had been expecting this. She had spent the previous evening preparing her counterdocumentation and had sent Maya a list of things she would need in the coming days, organized by priority, the top item being patience. The legal process, Carol had explained, operated on its own timeline, which bore no relationship to urgency or fairness or the obvious clarity of documentation. It could take weeks. It could take months. During that period, Maya would need to continue her life, which meant her 3 jobs and Lucas's school and the foreclosure proceeding that was still technically active, though Carol had filed a brief on that matter as well, citing the pending inheritance as grounds for a stay of proceedings, which the bank had provisionally granted for 30 days. She was at the diner at 5 the morning after the filing. She refilled coffee and called customers honey and split her tips with the busboy and said nothing to anyone about what was happening in Dunmore. She had told no one except Lucas, who had responded to the full accounting of the situation with a silence that lasted approximately 40 seconds and then broken into the most coherent set of questions she had ever heard a 13-year-old produce in rapid succession. He wanted to understand the legal mechanism. He wanted to know what contingency meant in practical terms. He wanted to know if they would have to move, and she told him not immediately, which was the honest answer. He had gone to bed that night, and she had heard him through the wall, not sleeping, the particular rhythm of someone lying awake thinking. She had resisted the urge to go in, because he was 13 and deserved the space to process things without his mother managing his reaction, and because she needed to trust that the qualities she had been watching develop in him since he was old enough to demonstrate them, the steadiness and the precision and the willingness to sit with uncertainty without collapsing, would hold. They held. The second call from Brenda came 4 days after the first, and this time Maya answered, because Carol had told her that controlled engagement was preferable to complete silence, which filled with assumptions that tended to be worse than reality. Brenda's voice had shed the personal register and acquired the quality of someone delivering a position prepared with assistance. She spoke about Harold's fragile state of mind in his final years. She spoke about undue influence, which was a legal concept she deployed with the particular confidence of someone who has recently learned a term and found it useful. She suggested that Harold's decision to leave the contents of the icebox to Maya rather than to the broader family represented an aberration, a departure from Harold's consistent values of family unity, which was a characterization of Harold's values that bore so little resemblance to the man in the notebooks that Maya had to press her lips together to keep her response from being something she would need to apologize for. She said instead, "Brenda, Harold documented everything. The acquisition records go back 60 years. The legal brief was prepared in 2019 when he was 89 and fully competent according to two physicians whose statements are in the record. There is no aberration here. There is a man who spent his life making precise decisions and made one more." The silence that followed this had a different quality than the silence of a person thinking. It had the quality of a person recalibrating. "He should have talked to us," Brenda said finally, and her voice had lost some of its prepared steadiness. "He should have said something. We had no idea." "No," Maya said. "He was very good at that." They filed in court 11 days after Carol's initial notice. The complaint from Brenda's attorneys was 43 pages and argued 5 distinct theories of relief, ranging from undue influence to fraudulent concealment to a claim that the icebox's contents were technically fixtures of the real property and therefore transferred with the house rather than separately. Carol had anticipated 4 of the 5 theories and had already prepared responses. The 5th, a creative argument about the definition of contents under the specific statutory language of the state's inheritance code, required 3 days of additional research that Carol conducted with an urgency that Maya recognized as the urgency of someone who is very good at her work and has encountered something that demands her best. Maya did what she had always done while waiting for things outside her control to resolve. She worked. She cleaned offices in the dark, moving through the Fenwick Plaza with the efficiency of someone who has internalized the geography. She lifted packages at the fulfillment center and did not think about the number written on the corner of Harold's letter, because thinking about it during those hours would have made it impossible to do the hours, and the hours were still required. The foreclosure stay was 30 days. Carol's contingency arrangement meant no upfront legal costs. But the ordinary math of survival had not paused for any of this. The break came from a direction she had not anticipated. Gerald Watts was Harold's neighbor, the man who had received the tools in the will, and he appeared at Maya's apartment on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the filing, having obtained her address from Raymond Oaks in the way of people who are persistent and who have a quality of purpose that makes administrative barriers less effective than they might otherwise be. He was 73, lean and weathered in the way of men who have spent their lives outdoors, and he had the same quality of watchful stillness that Harold had possessed, which made sense given that they had apparently spent 50 years as neighbors and had developed, in the way of people who live in proximity and share a fundamental disposition, something close to a private language. He sat at Maya's kitchen table and accepted coffee and looked around the apartment with eyes that registered the water stain on the ceiling and the pull-out couch and the organized efficiency of a household operating on very tight constraints, and did not comment on any of it in the way of someone who understands that observation is not the same as judgment. "I have something for you," he said, and produced from the inside pocket of his jacket a sealed envelope considerably thicker than the ones Harold had left in the house. "Harold gave it to me 9 months ago. Told me to bring it to you personally when things got difficult. He said I would know when difficult had arrived." "How did you know?" she asked. Gerald set his hands flat on the table. "Because Brenda called me last week and offered me $8,000 for Harold's tools and asked me what I knew about the icebox." Gerald's expression did not change, but something in his eyes did. "I told her I didn't know anything about any icebox. Then I called Raymond Oaks, who told me there was a legal contest in progress. Then I came here." She opened the envelope. Inside was a document she had not found in the notebooks or the other letters, a handwritten record of 4 conversations Harold had documented, each one dated, each one describing a specific interaction with a person in the room who did not know they were being documented. 2 of the conversations were with Raymond Oaks, from 2018 and 2020, in which Harold had clearly and explicitly stated his intentions regarding the bequest, and Raymond had clearly and explicitly acknowledged understanding those intentions and his obligation to execute them faithfully. The documentation was not a recording. It was Harold's meticulous account written immediately after each conversation, the kind of contemporaneous record that carries significant evidential weight. The third conversation was with a physician, a formal capacity assessment Harold had voluntarily sought and documented, in which two doctors confirmed his mental clarity and his understanding of the legal and financial implications of his estate decisions. The physician's signatures were there, dated 2021. The fourth document was the one that made Maya set her coffee cup down very carefully on the table and sit with her hands in her lap and breathe. It was a letter from Harold to the family, all of them, addressed collectively and written 2 years before his death, in which he explained, in the precise and unornate language he applied to everything, exactly why he had made the choices he had made. He had watched this family for 9 decades, he wrote. He had watched comfort breed assumption, and assumption breed entitlement, and entitlement breed the specific blindness of people who have never had to pay careful attention because the world has always arranged itself around their inattention. He did not write this with anger. He wrote it as observation, the way a machinist describes the tolerances of a part, without emotion but without imprecision either. He had watched Maya's mother, Sandra, work herself to exhaustion to give her daughter a better margin than the one she had inherited, and he had watched Sandra die before that margin materialized. He had watched Maya pick up the weight without being asked and carry it without complaint and still, somehow, in the midst of all of it, maintain the quality of attention that distinguished people who understood the world from people who merely occupied it. He had watched her organize her kitchen. That was the sentence that appeared in the letter. He had watched her organize her kitchen, and he had known then with the certainty that 60 years of precision work confers on a person, that she was the one who would find the panel. I am not giving her the gold because she is poor, Harold wrote. I am giving her the gold because she earned the right to find it through 60 years of someone else's patience and her own, and because I believe she will use it the way I would have used it if I had been a younger man with less solitude and more family to care about. I am not punishing the rest of the family. I am choosing the right person for the particular task of what comes next. I have always chosen people this way. It is, I believe, the only meaningful way to choose. The letter was signed and dated and witnessed by Gerald Watts and by a second neighbor whose name Maya did not recognize, but whose address Gerald confirmed was 3 doors down from Harold's house and who was, he indicated, available to testify if necessary. She sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread before her, and she thought about Harold driving 4 hours to sit in her kitchen, and she thought about his eyes moving around the apartment, and she understood now, with complete clarity, that he had not been offering comfort, and he had not been assessing her poverty, and he had not been performing the duty visit of a distant relative doing the minimum required by conscience. He had been evaluating her. He had been deciding. She looked at Gerald across the table. Did you know, she asked, about what was in the icebox? He was quiet for a moment. I knew he kept something in that basement he cared about very much. I knew he spent a great deal of attention on it over the years. Harold was not a man who told you things directly. He showed you what mattered by what he gave his attention to. Did you look? Gerald's expression shifted in a way that suggested the question was more complex than it appeared. Harold showed me once, he said, maybe 20 years ago. He opened the panel and showed me what was on the shelves, and then he closed it again, and we went upstairs, and he made coffee, and we talked about something else entirely, and neither of us mentioned it again. He paused. That was Harold's way of trusting you. He showed you the thing he trusted you not to touch. Carol received the envelope's contents by secure electronic transfer the same afternoon. Her response was a single sentence. This changes the calculus substantially. The family's attorneys received formal notice of the additional documentation on a Monday. By Wednesday, the theory of undue influence had been formally withdrawn from the complaint. By Friday, one of the 3 theories of fraudulent concealment had also been dropped. The fixture argument remained, the one requiring Carol's additional research, and it was the one around which the remaining fight consolidated, because it was the most technically complex and the one least vulnerable to Harold's meticulous documentation of intent. The fixture argument, stripped of its legal language, was this. When a commercial appliance is installed in a property in a manner that integrates it into the structure of the building, certain jurisdictions treat it as part of the real property rather than as personal property. If the icebox could be shown to be a fixture of the house rather than an item of personal property, its contents would transfer with the house to Brenda rather than separately to Maya. Carol's research had produced a counter-argument grounded in 3 precedents and the specific details of Harold's installation. The icebox was freestanding. It had never been plumbed or wired into the building's systems. It rested on the basement floor on casters, which were still functional, meaning it could be moved. And critically, Harold had explicitly designated it as personal property in a rider to his insurance policy filed in 2018, documentation that Carol had obtained through a request to the insurance company that had taken 12 days and considerable persistence. The fixture argument, Carol told Maya, is technically alive but practically weak. We will win on this point. The question is how long they intend to sustain it before they recognize that sustaining it costs more than conceding. How long, Maya asked. Carol considered this with the manner of someone calculating odds they have encountered before. In my experience, people who are fighting primarily because they cannot accept losing rather than because they have a genuine legal position sustain the fight until something external forces a reassessment. Either they run out of money to pay their attorneys, which in Brenda's case may take some time, or something happens that makes the cost of continuing more visible than the cost of conceding. Something external, Maya repeated. Carol looked at her. I want you to understand that I am not suggesting any action on your part. But these situations have a tendency to develop their own momentum. Documents have a way of reaching interested parties. Information that is technically public record has a way of becoming more public. She said this without elaboration and moved on to other matters. The information became public on a Thursday, which was not, as far as Maya could determine, the result of any deliberate action by anyone she knew. The Dunmore Courier, which was a small paper with a surprisingly engaged readership for its size, published a brief item about the probate filing, which was public record, noting that a significant contested estate proceeding was underway involving the late Harold Rutherford and a reported asset of considerable value. The item was 6 sentences long and named no dollar figures. By the following Monday, a regional news outlet had obtained a copy of the probate filing, which contained Robert Cheng's certified assayer's report, and had published a story whose headline Maya read on her phone during a bathroom break at the fulfillment center. Local machinist's hidden gold collection worth over $300 million. Family battle follows. She stood in the bathroom for 2 minutes doing nothing except breathing. Lucas called during her lunch break. He had seen the article, which had spread through his school with the velocity that genuinely remarkable news achieves when it involves someone people know or know of, even tangentially. He was using the careful voice he used when he was managing his own reaction rather than expressing it. Mom, I know. Are you okay? I'm at work. I'll be okay. People at school are talking about it. She had anticipated this, but not at speed. She had thought they had more time before the exposure reached the level of their ordinary life, their neighborhood and his school, and the specific geography of people who knew them. But information that contains a large number travels fast and does not respect the timeline of the people it concerns. Tell them whatever you want to tell them, she said. Tell them your mother is handling it. That's all you need to say. The regional story became a national story within 48 hours, which Maya understood in the abstract, but whose practical implications arrived in the form of a news van parked outside her building on a Wednesday morning when she was leaving for the diner at 4:50, and a man she did not recognize approaching her in the parking lot of Hector's Diner at 7:30 with a camera and a microphone and a producer's assistant scurrying behind him. She said nothing to the camera. She said, "My attorney handles media," which was technically true in that Carol had told her to direct any media contact to the firm, and she walked into the diner and put on her apron and served breakfast to people who in some cases recognized her from the news, and in most cases did not, and who all, regardless, received the same quality of service because she had not become a different person overnight and was not going to start performing her situation for anyone's benefit. Derek called Carol that afternoon, not Brenda's attorneys. Derek personally. Carol took the call and reported back to Maya with the concision she applied to everything. He wants to discuss settlement, Carol said. She had expected this to feel like something. A vindication or a relief or the satisfaction of a position that has been tested and held. Instead, it felt like the next item on a list, which was perhaps the most accurate way to understand it. The fight had never been about the satisfaction of defeating anyone. It had been about the simple and total question of whether Harold's intentions would be honored. What kind of settlement? Maya asked. Carol's expression indicated that the terms Derek had initially floated were not worth the time it would take to describe them. He began from a position that assumed you are more desperate than you are and more afraid than you are. I told him the actual situation. which is, which is that you have complete documentation, an airtight bequest, an independent certified assayer's report, a letter from the decedent explaining his intentions in language that would take a decade of appeals to meaningfully challenge, and an attorney who finds this case interesting enough that the question of fees has ceased to be a primary motivating factor. Carol paused. He took a moment to absorb that. What did he say after the moment? He asked what you want. Maya looked at the window of Carol's office. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, moving with its complicated, indifferent energy. The same city she had been cleaning offices in at midnight for 14 months. The same city where the foreclosure notice had arrived on a Tuesday. It looked different from this window, and she was not sure if it was the light or the elevation or the fact that she had spent 3 weeks in the particular company of her own agency, which changed how things look. I want what Harold intended, she said. I want his documentation honored and his estate distributed as written. I want the gold authenticated, transferred, and cleared. I want to pay off the foreclosure and stabilize our situation, and then I want to do what the notebook labeled 2019 describes. That is what I want. Not one thing more. Carol wrote this down. She did not ask about the notebook labeled 2019, which was, Maya thought, one of the things she respected most about Carol, the ability to trust that information would be shared when it needed to be shared, and not to press for it before that moment. She went home that evening to find Lucas at the kitchen table with Harold's notebooks spread around him, all 12 of them, organized by decade. His own notebook open beside them in which he was apparently cross-referencing entries with data he had pulled from financial history websites on his phone. He had been doing this, she understood, for several days, in the hours after school, working his way through Harold's documentation with the focused methodical attention he brought to mathematics. He looked up when she came in. He had an expression she recognized as the expression of someone who has followed a chain of logic to its conclusion and found the conclusion both larger and more specific than they had expected. Do you know what he did? Lucas said. Not what he accumulated. What he did with it. The framework. Tell me, she said, because Harold's second letter had described it. But she wanted to hear it from Lucas, to understand what her son had found in the numbers. He bought gold instead of a lifestyle, Lucas said. He lived on his machinist's salary. He never upgraded the house beyond what it needed. He never bought a car that was more than transportation. He converted every surplus dollar into metal, and he put it in a place no one would think to look, because no one would think to look in the thing that looked most worthless. He stopped and looked at the notebooks. He understood that the best hiding place is the thing people have already decided is not worth examining. She sat down across from him and did not speak for a moment. He was building something for someone, Lucas said. He was just waiting to find out who. She thought about the permission slip and signed in his backpack. She thought about what the notebook labeled 2019 described, the framework Harold had outlined for what should come after the gold was secured and the legal process was settled, and the question of what to do with $331 million became a practical problem rather than an abstract one. She was going to tell Lucas about it, but not tonight. Tonight she wanted him to finish his own process of understanding, to arrive at Harold through the notebooks the way Harold had apparently wanted him to, through the numbers that told the truth about a man more accurately than any biography could. I need to ask you something, she said. He looked at her. The math competition. The 8th grade one. The $55 fee. His expression shifted. Mom, that's not important right now. The deadline for registration. Is it still open? He was quiet for a moment, caught between the habit of suppressing the want and the unfamiliar sensation of not needing to. I think so. The regional qualifier is in 3 weeks. She had $214 in her checking account, which was the same amount she had started with the morning after the foreclosure notice. Nothing about the legal situation had yet produced a single accessible dollar. The gold was in a basement in Dunmore under a legal hold while the contested probate proceeded. The foreclosure stay had been extended for 60 days pending resolution of the estate matter. The 3 jobs continued to generate the same $2,600 a month minus expenses that never quite balanced. But she had, in the last 3 weeks, spent the small amount of reserve money she had kept for genuine emergencies in ways that had turned out not to be emergencies. The bus fares to Dunmore. The borrowed car on one occasion. The cost of 3 calls to Frank Alderman, whose advice had been given freely, but whose time she had felt obligated to acknowledge. The $55, she said slowly, is something I should have found 3 weeks ago. The registration portal is online, he said, still watching her. There might be a late registration fee. Is there a late registration fee? He picked up his phone. Check something. His expression produced a small involuntary change in its corners. It's 60. There's a $15 late fee. She sat back in her chair. The kitchen light was what it always was, one working bulb in a fixture designed for two. The water stain on the ceiling was what it always was, a pale geography that had defeated her 6 complaints to the property management company. The pull-out couch was what it always was, visible through the doorway behind Lucas, occupying its corner with the resigned competence of an object that was being asked to be more than it was made for. She picked up her phone and opened the bank app. She transferred $60 to the payment link Lucas read aloud from the competition website. She watched the balance fall to $154. She held the phone steady in both hands and did not let her face do what it wanted to do. Submit it, she said. Lucas looked at her and then looked at his phone and submitted the registration. The confirmation appeared in under 3 seconds, the efficiency of systems that process payment faster than any other kind of information. He set his phone down. Something in his posture had shifted, something subtle and structural, the way a building settles differently when a load is properly distributed. Mom. Yeah. He did not say thank you, which she was grateful for, because she was not sure she could have maintained her composure through thank you. And she needed to maintain her composure because there was a long list of things still required between now and the moment this was actually finished. And getting through them would require exactly the quality of steady attention that Harold Rutherford had apparently recognized in her from the way she organized her kitchen and had trusted across years of distance to be there when it was needed. She went to bed on the pull-out couch that night and lay in the dark and thought about Harold Watts and his quiet eyes and his 60 years of patience and his understanding that the most important investments are the ones whose returns you will not live to see. She thought about the bars in the double wall of the icebox, cool and dense and enormously patient, waiting in the dark for someone who would notice the discrepancy between interior and exterior measurements. She thought about Derek's call and the word settlement and what it meant when people who have been trying to take something from you begin asking what you want. It meant the fight had shifted. It did not mean the fight was over. She had read enough of Harold's notebooks to understand the difference between a position that is winning and a position that has won, and she understood that the distance between those 2 points contained the most dangerous territory, the space where people who are losing decide they have nothing left to lose and begin acting accordingly. Brenda's attorneys filed an emergency motion on a Friday morning, 3 days after Derek's settlement overture, which told her everything she needed to know about the coordination between Brenda and Derek's public positions and their private ones. The motion requested a temporary restraining order preventing the transfer of any assets from Harold's estate pending resolution of the underlying contest, which Carol had anticipated, and it also requested a court-ordered inventory of the icebox's contents, which Carol had anticipated, but which had an implication that she flagged for Maya immediately. A court-ordered inventory requires access to the property, Carol said, which is Brenda's property, and during the inventory process, the contents are technically in the court's custody, which means there is a window, however narrow, during which the chain of custody over those bars passes through a process that Brenda's legal team will have direct access to. Carol paused. It is a legitimate legal mechanism. It is also being used as a leverage point. The message is that the longer this continues, the more opportunities for complication arise. Maya was at the diner when this call came in. She stepped outside into the alley beside the building, holding the phone to her ear and looking at the dumpsters and the fire escape and the specific texture of a working life conducted in places where aesthetic considerations are not prioritized. What do we do? She said. We accelerate, Carol said. We push for an expedited hearing on the core legal question. If we can get a ruling on the bequest language within the next 3 weeks, we remove the leverage entirely. Can we? I have a relationship with the presiding judge's clerk and a compelling case. I believe yes, with significant effort. Make the effort, Maya said. She went back inside and refilled coffee and called the next customer honey and did not think about the motion or the leverage or the specific machinations of people who had more resources than she did and were currently applying those resources against her. She thought about Harold's notebooks. She thought about the way he had described his decision-making process in 1961, The year he made his first purchase, sitting at the kitchen table of that same Dunmore house, calculating what the next 40 years of discipline would produce, and then proceeding to produce it, one careful decision at a time, without fanfare and without reassurance from anyone, and without any guarantee that he would live to see the outcome. She thought about patience as a form of precision. She thought about the icebox sitting in Brenda's basement, monumental and still, and carrying its weight with the complete indifference of a thing that is exactly what it is and requires nothing from anyone in order to continue being it. The expedited hearing was granted for 3 weeks out, which was not as fast as Maya needed, but significantly faster than Brenda's attorneys had counted on, given that expedited hearings required demonstrating urgency, and Carol's demonstration of urgency had included a calculation of the daily cost to Maya of the legal hold on the estate, presented as a financial harm that the court had an obligation to consider. In the 12 days between the filing and the hearing date, 3 things happened that Maya had not expected. The first was that Gerald Watts called to say that 2 men he did not recognize had been photographed by his security camera examining the exterior of Harold's house at approximately 2 in the morning on a Wednesday, and that the camera had captured their license plate, and that he had provided this information to the county sheriff's office, who were making inquiries. The second was that Robert Chang's assayer's report was leaked to a second national news outlet by a source Carol could not identify, and was published in a form that included the specific bar count and total valuation, which generated a second wave of media coverage significantly larger than the first, and which included several opinion pieces about the ethics of estate law and the particular situation of a woman working 3 jobs and sleeping on a pull-out couch who had been left a $300 million gold collection by an uncle who had known her mostly from a distance and had trusted her with everything. The third thing was that Brenda called Maya directly for the second time, and this time her voice had shed both the prepared position and the controlled outrage, and carried something underneath both of those that sounded, if Maya was reading it correctly, like exhaustion. "Maya," she said, "I need to understand something. Did you know before the reading?" "No," Maya said. "And you found it yourself? In the basement?" "Yes." Brenda was quiet for a long moment. "Harold never showed any of us." "No. He showed Gerald once. He showed his neighbor once," Brenda said, and the way she said it carried something that was not exactly bitterness and not exactly grief, but occupied the space between them. The acknowledgement of a relationship that had been proximate but never close, that had offered the appearance of intimacy without the substance, that had built itself around visits and prescriptions and funeral arrangements without ever producing the quality of attention that Harold had apparently been looking for and had found in a kitchen 4 hours away. "I'm sorry," Maya said. She meant it without strategy. Not because she owed Brenda an apology and not because the expression of sorrow advanced her legal position, but because Brenda had spent years in the vicinity of a man she had never understood and had now discovered the distance after it was too late to close it. Brenda did not respond to the apology directly. She said, "My attorneys will see yours at the hearing." And she ended the call. Maya stood in her apartment after that call and held the phone in her hand and thought about the quality of choices people make when they cannot see clearly. The way proximity to something valuable is not the same as understanding what makes it valuable. The way attention paid to surfaces produces a very different kind of knowledge than attention paid to the thing underneath. She thought about Harold's eyes. She thought about Gerald saying he had opened the panel once and they had gone upstairs and never mentioned it again. She thought about the kind of trust that demonstrates itself by not requiring anything. She looked at the foreclosure notice, still on the coffee table, its 90-day deadline now 12 days extended. She looked at the water stain. She looked at the pull-out couch. Then she picked up Harold's letter from the drawer where she had put it for safekeeping and read the last 2 paragraphs again. The one she had been saving in the way you save a certain quality of nourishment for the moments when you most need it. "You will face people who believe that wealth belongs to those who already have it," Harold had written. "You will face systems that were built to ensure this. You will face the specific exhaustion of being the person who must work harder than everyone else to hold what is legitimately yours, simply because you started from a place that those systems did not design for people like you. Do not let the exhaustion make you small. The gold is not the point. The gold is just the mechanism. What you do with the freedom it creates is what I spent 60 years building toward. I trust you to know what that is. I trusted you with the panel. I trust you with this." She folded the letter and put it back. 3 days before the hearing, Derek's settlement offer arrived through proper channels, formatted as a legal document. He was offering to drop all contested claims in exchange for 10% of the verified value, approximately $33 million, framed as compensation for the family's emotional distress and Brenda's role in managing Harold's affairs in his final years. Carol presented this to Maya without recommendation because it was her standard practice to present offers without advocacy and allow her client to decide. Maya considered it for approximately 4 minutes. "No," she said. Carol nodded once and drafted the rejection. The hearing was in 8 days. The icebox was in Brenda's basement, waiting with the infinite patience of metal. Harold's notebooks were in Maya's canvas bag, which she carried everywhere now the way she had once carried the notepad she tracked her hours on, because some things need to stay close. Lucas had submitted his science competition registration. The confirmation was on the refrigerator, held by a magnet from the hardware store that Lucas had bought for 39 cents from the bin at the checkout counter on a Saturday afternoon when they had gone to get light bulbs, an errand so ordinary that it had achieved, in the days since, a quality almost sacred, the evidence of a life that was still proceeding with its ordinary requirements even while extraordinary things convened around it. She was not home yet. She still had the 9 o'clock cleaning shift. She put on her jacket and picked up the canvas bag and went to do the work. The morning of the hearing, Maya woke at 3:45, which was 15 minutes before her alarm, which was itself unnecessary because she had not slept in the conventional sense of the word. She had rested in the way of people who have learned to extract something useful from the hours their body will not surrender to full unconsciousness, a monitored stillness that left her rested enough to function and alert enough to be useful. She lay on the pull-out couch in the dark and ran through everything one final time the way she ran through inventory at the fulfillment center before a major audit, not because she expected to find an error, but because the process of verification was itself a form of preparation, a way of converting anxiety into readiness. She knew Harold's documentation the way she knew the geography of the Fenwick office plaza at midnight, by feel and precision, without needing the light on. She knew the bequest language. She knew the assayer's certification. She knew the letter Harold had written to the family and the capacity assessment signed by 2 physicians and the insurance rider that classified the icebox as personal property in 2018. She knew Gerald's testimony, which had been submitted in written form with his signature, and Frank Alderman's brief, and every counterargument Brenda's attorneys had floated and subsequently abandoned. She knew the fixture argument, which was the last one standing, and she knew Carol's response to it, which was built on 3 jurisdictional precedents, the Castor documentation and the insurance classification, and which was, Carol had told her the previous evening with the composed directness of someone who does not make promises but is willing to state probabilities, the strongest position she had argued in the specific domain of contested estate asset classification in 30 years of practice. She rose at 4 and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with Harold's notebooks arrayed around her, not reading them, just allowing their presence to constitute a form of company. The kitchen light was what it had always been, 1 working bulb. The water stain on the ceiling was what it had always been. The pull-out couch occupied its corner with its customary resigned competence. She thought about what she was walking into and what she was walking away from. And she understood for the first time with complete clarity that these were the same thing, that the hearing was not a door between one kind of life and another, but a passage that had been opening slowly for 37 days, the length of time between the phone call from Raymond Oakes's office and this morning, each day adding incremental certainty to a direction that had been set by Harold Rutherford 9 months ago when he handed Gerald what's a sealed envelope and said to deliver it when things got difficult. Lucas appeared in the doorway at 5:15, dressed already, which she had not asked him to be. "I'm coming," he said. She looked at him. He was 13, which meant he was in the specific territory of being old enough to understand the stakes and young enough that his presence in the courtroom would require her to manage both her own composure and his, which was an additional variable she had not budgeted for. "You have school," she said. He looked at her with the expression he used when her arguments were technically correct and practically beside the point. "Mom, I'm coming." She poured him coffee, which she did not normally do because he was 13 and she had views about caffeine. But this was not a normal morning, and the gesture of treating him, as someone whose presence was appropriate, seemed more important than the caffeine question. He accepted the mug with both hands and sat across from her, and they drank coffee together in the kitchen light that was one bulb and did not speak, because what needed to be said had been said, and what had not been said was the kind of thing that does not benefit from words. They drove to Dunmore in Carol's car, which Carol had offered without being asked, arriving at the courthouse at 8:15 for a 9 o'clock proceeding. The building was a modest two-story structure with the institutional solidity of county government architecture from the 1950s, granite steps and brass handrails, and a lobby that smelled of floor wax, and that particular quality of accumulated official business that accumulates in buildings where consequential things happen routinely and unremarkably to people who experience them as anything but routine. Brenda's attorneys were already in the corridor, 3 of them, arranged with the unconscious formation of people accustomed to projecting collective authority. They were all in the dark suits that functioned as the uniform of their profession in formal settings, briefcases positioned, tablets ready, the studied ease of people who spend considerable portions of their working lives in corridors like this one. They registered Maya's arrival with the specific quality of attention that opposing counsel directs toward a person they have spent weeks building a case against, the assessment that takes in everything and reveals nothing. Derek was with them, which she had not expected. He stood slightly apart from the attorneys in a manner that suggested either physical discomfort with the setting or an effort to signal that he was present as interested party rather than as combatant, a distinction that would have been easier to maintain if he had not spent the previous 5 weeks filing emergency motions and floating settlement numbers. He met her eyes briefly and looked away. Brenda was not present. Carol noted this with a brief remark as they settled their documents at the plaintiff's table. Brenda is signaling that she is willing to let this go to the decision. She is not here to fight for a particular outcome. She is here, through her attorneys, to complete the legal process and accept the result. Is that good? Lucas said quietly. It means she has already accepted what is coming, Carol said. She just needs the court to make it official. Judge Patricia Harlow entered at 9:02. She was 63. With reading glasses, she wore on a chain and a manner of deliberate attention that did not distinguish between the attorneys and the people at each table, treating all of them as relevant to the proceeding rather than sorted by function. She had reviewed the submitted materials before the hearing, which was apparent from the quality of her opening questions, which went directly to the fixture argument and the specific language of Harold's bequest. The next 2 hours unfolded with the formal rhythm of legal proceedings, which is a rhythm that bears no relationship to dramatic acceleration but which carries its own weight. Brenda's lead attorney, a man named Prescott whose professional manner suggested decades of contested estate work, presented the fixture argument with considerable technical skill. He cited jurisdictional precedent. He raised questions about the intent of the installation. He argued that a commercial appliance installed in a residential basement in 1963 and not moved for 60 years met the applicable definition of a fixture under the relevant statutory language. Carol's response was methodical and precise. She entered the caster documentation, photographs of the icebox's mounting that demonstrated its freestanding character. She entered the 2018 insurance rider. She presented the 3 jurisdictional precedents and distinguished each of Prescott's citations with the quiet confidence of someone who has spent a considerable portion of 3 weeks in legal archives. She entered Harold's statement of intent from the letter to the family, which the court had already reviewed, but which she read aloud in the manner of someone who believes that certain documents deserve to be heard as well as read. Judge Harlow listened to all of it. She asked 7 questions, 4 of them directed at Prescott and 3 at Carol, each one specific, each one indicating that she had already located the pressure points in both arguments and was testing them rather than discovering them. At 11:20, she called a 15-minute recess. Maya sat at the plaintiff's table and did not speak during the recess. Lucas sat beside her with his hands flat on the table in a gesture she recognized as his version of the deliberate stillness she had been practicing herself for the past several weeks, the physical expression of choosing not to spend energy on things outside your control. Carol reviewed her notes. The room settled into its own particular pre-decision atmosphere, the quality of held breath that is not tension exactly, but the state of things before they are resolved. She thought about Harold. She thought about him in the basement in 1963, directing the installation of the icebox with those measuring eyes, already knowing what he intended to use it for, already thinking decades ahead to a person who did not yet exist in any form he could have specifically predicted, but whose qualities he had apparently been watching for across years of distance. She thought about the patience that required, the discipline of building something toward an outcome you will never see, sustaining it through decades of ordinary life, through the Dunmore metal works and the long evenings in the house on the county road and the Saturdays with Gerald next door, through the years of accumulation and documentation and the careful, quiet work of making something that would survive you. She thought about what the notebook labeled 2019 described, what Harold had outlined as the purpose of the thing he had built. Judge Harlow returned at 11:37. She settled at the bench and arranged her notes with the deliberate precision that had characterized everything she had done in this room. And she began to speak in the measured cadence of someone who has reached a conclusion they are confident in and intends to express it completely. The central question in this matter, she said, is whether the contents of the appliance designated in the decedent's will as the icebox constitute personal property properly bequeathed to the named beneficiary, or whether those contents transfer as part of the real property to the beneficiary of the estate's primary real asset. She paused. This is fundamentally a question of intent, classification, and the specific language the decedent chose. She reviewed the fixture argument with the same technical attention she had applied to hearing it. She cited the jurisdictional precedents Prescott had raised. She distinguished them from the current circumstances with reasoning that followed Carroll's line closely but arrived at its conclusions through its own path, which was the mark of a judge who had done independent analysis rather than simply adopted one side's framing. The appliance in question, she said, rests on its original casters. It has never been affixed to the building's systems. It is classified as personal property in the decedent's own insurance filings. Most significantly, the decedent's will uses language that is specific and unambiguous. The icebox and all that it contains. This language, read in conjunction with the extensive documentation of the decedent's intent, leaves no meaningful interpretive space for the argument that only the appliance itself was bequeathed. The contents are named explicitly. The decedent was a man of precise language, as the record demonstrates comprehensively. He did not use the phrase all that it contains by accident or in ignorance of its implications. She set down her notes. The court finds for the beneficiary Maya Calloway. The contents of the appliance designated as the icebox in Harold Rutherford's will are confirmed as personal property, legally and unambiguously bequeathed to Ms. Calloway under the terms of the will as written. The contested claims are dismissed. The stay on asset transfer is lifted, effective immediately. The court orders the probate estate to proceed to final settlement within 30 days. The silence in the courtroom lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Lucas made a sound that was not a word. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and looked at the ceiling. Carol placed her hand briefly on Maya's arm, which was as much celebration as Carol's professional manner permitted in a courtroom, and which communicated everything it needed to. Prescott gathered his materials with the composed efficiency of a man who has lost cases before and understands that conducting yourself with dignity in defeat is as important to your professional reputation as winning, which was a quality Maya found herself involuntarily respecting even in this moment. Derek stood in his corner of the room, looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man recalculating. He did not approach Maya. He did not speak to Carol. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and walked toward the door and paused there, one hand on the frame, not looking at anyone in particular. Harold was always the smartest person in any room he walked into, Derek said. We just never noticed because he didn't make you feel it. He left. Maya sat at the plaintiff's table for another moment after the room had mostly cleared. Lucas had his arm around her shoulders, which required him to reach up slightly because she was taller. And this minor anatomical inversion was so characteristic of the particular way they had always navigated their relationship, the logistics of being exactly who they were rather than who the situation might suggest they should be, that she felt a laugh arrive unexpectedly from somewhere under the emotion, quiet and real. We won, Lucas said. She nodded. Harold won. She nodded again, because that was more accurate and he knew it, and the knowing of it was part of what made him the person he was. The practical mechanics of what followed the ruling occupied the next 18 days in a manner that made the 3 weeks of legal fighting seem, in retrospect, almost leisurely. The probate estate moved towards settlement with the urgency that court orders impose on processes that had previously been running at the pace of contested litigation. Robert Chung returned to Dunmore for the formal transfer documentation, producing a final certified inventory that served as the legal record of what was being transferred and to whom. Carol coordinated with a specialized precious metals transport company whose name Maya found instructive. The company's entire existence premised on the understanding that gold, once its location becomes known, requires a certain quality of escort. The transport required 2 days and 4 vehicles and documentation that Maya signed with the steady hand of someone who had spent 3 weeks practicing the act of not flinching at large numbers. The gold went to a secured facility in Atlanta whose vaults were certified by the London Bullion Market Association and whose operating procedures she reviewed beforehand with the same thoroughness she had brought to reading Harold's notebooks, because some habits of attention are worth keeping regardless of what is being attended to. On the day the transfer was completed, Carol called with the final accounting. The certified total, adjusted for 3 days of market movement, was $332,800,000, and some additional amount that Maya told Carol she did not need to hear expressed in cents. She was at the diner when this call came in. She was between tables, a coffee pot in one hand and a pen behind her ear, which was where she always kept a pen. She stepped into the kitchen and leaned against the wall beside the walk-in refrigerator and listened to the number one more time and said, "Thank you," and ended the call. She went back to the floor and refilled 3 coffees and wrote down an order for a table of 4 who were from out of town and wanted to know what was good, and she told them the eggs were good and the biscuits were made fresh that morning and the coffee was strong enough to constitute a commitment, which made them laugh and tip well, which meant she had something to split with the busboy on her way out. She gave notice at the diner that afternoon. Hector, whose real name was Michael, but who had bought the diner from a man named Hector and kept the name because the sign was still good, listened to her with the expression of a man who had been running a small diner for 22 years and had seen a considerable range of things happen to the people who worked for him and who was not, in this instance, surprised in the specific way of someone whose staff had started being followed by news cameras 3 weeks ago. He shook her hand. He told her she was the best waitress he had ever employed, which she knew to be an exaggeration but accepted in the spirit it was offered. He told her the job was there if she wanted it, which she knew was not something he was obligated to say, and which she recognized as the specific generosity of a person who runs a small establishment with tight margins and genuine care for the people in it. She left her apron on the hook and walked out into the afternoon. She gave notice at the Fenwick office plaza that evening, which required a call to a facilities manager she had never met in person because she was one of 11 cleaning staff on a contracted rotation and her interactions with management had been limited to the monthly paperwork she submitted confirming her hours. The facilities manager said he was sorry to lose her and asked if she could provide 2 weeks' notice, which she agreed to, because the practical reality was that 18 days of legal and financial processing had not yet produced accessible funds, and the pull-out couch was still the pull-out couch, and Lucas had a competition in 11 days. She gave notice at the fulfillment center on a Saturday, during her shift, by finding the shift manager and delivering it in person, because she believed that face-to-face notice was a form of respect for the institution even when the institution was a warehouse, where bathroom breaks were timed, and the ambient noise of machinery made conversation difficult. The shift manager, a woman named Rosa who had worked the same warehouse for 9 years and who had, over 14 months of overlapping schedules, developed the particular collegial warmth of people who shared difficult conditions with mutual competence, expressed something complicated with her face before settling on congratulations. She said she had read the articles. She said she thought it was remarkable. She said, "I always knew you were going to go somewhere." Maya thought about this on the drive home. The strange grammar of that sentence, its combination of faith in retrospect and the specific timing of its expression, arriving now that somewhere had become a confirmed destination. She was not angry at Rosa for not saying it earlier. She understood that the saying and the knowing are different operations, and that most people are waiting for confirmation before they offer the first, which is not cruelty, just caution, the reasonable management of a world that contains more disappointment than triumph, and in which enthusiasm in advance of outcomes carries the risk of looking foolish. She was not interested in making anyone look foolish. The notebook labeled 2019 had described Harold's vision in the specific practical language he applied to everything, which meant it was not a dream or a philosophical position but a plan, documented with the same rigor as his gold acquisition records. He had anticipated the legal contest and estimated its duration. He had outlined a framework for the first 2 years of asset management, including a recommendation that the gold be partially converted to diversified holdings over time rather than immediately, which Carol confirmed was sound. He had described, in the final 20 pages of the notebook, what he believed Maya should do with what he called the freedom the gold creates. He had not been prescriptive in the manner of someone who believed their vision should override the judgment of the person who inherited it. He had been descriptive in the manner of someone who had spent 91 years watching what poverty actually does to people and had formed specific views about where intervention produces the most durable change. The problem, Harold had written, is not that poor people lack money. This is true, but it is the surface of the problem. The actual problem is that poverty eliminates margin. Without margin, there is no capacity to absorb ordinary setbacks. A missed shift becomes an eviction. A medical bill becomes a decade of debt. A car breaking down becomes a cascade that touches every other element of a family's stability. The interventions that matter most are not the ones that make people comfortable. They are the ones that create margin, the buffer between the ordinary difficulties of living and the catastrophic consequences that poverty converts them into. He had described 3 specific things he believed this principle argued for. The first was a fund for working parents, not a scholarship in the traditional sense, which typically required applicants to suspend their working lives to pursue education, but a support structure that allowed people who were already working, already raising children, already managing the arithmetic of survival, to add incremental education or training without having to choose between learning and eating. The fund would cover not tuition but the margin, childcare costs, and transportation, and the specific small financial crises that derailed people who were trying to improve their situation while simultaneously keeping it from collapsing. The second was emergency stabilization grants, small amounts, $500 to $2,000, available quickly and without the documentary requirements that made most emergency assistance inaccessible to the people who needed it most by the time they became accessible. Harold had been specific about this. The amounts that change outcomes at the crisis point are almost never large, he wrote. They are amounts that most financially comfortable people would classify as minor inconveniences. A car repair, a utility shutoff, a dental emergency, a gap between paychecks when the timing misaligns with the rent. These are the amounts that tip families from precarious into catastrophic, and they are the amounts that are most straightforwardly addressed by direct support that does not require the person in crisis to demonstrate their poverty with sufficient evidence to satisfy a committee. The third was what Harold called a visibility initiative, which in his language meant a systematic effort to make the labor of invisible workers legible. He had been thinking about this for decades, he wrote, ever since he understood that the reason his own labor as a machinist was valued differently than the labor of people who moved through the world in more visible roles had nothing to do with the skill or importance of what he did, and everything to do with whether the people in positions of cultural authority could see it. The initiative he described was practical rather than ceremonial, partnerships with employers, unions, and municipalities to establish wage floors, recognition programs, and career pathways for the categories of work that held everything together and received the least acknowledgement for doing so. She had read these pages the night before the hearing, sitting at the kitchen table with Harold's handwriting covering the surface in front of her, and she had thought about Charlotte Morrison in the other story. The one about the woman who had spent 53 years as a housekeeper and had built something extraordinary through patience and loyalty and the specific understanding that the value of a thing is not determined by whether the people around you can see it. She had thought about what it meant to come from a line of people who understood this, who kept showing up to work that went unrecognized and kept building toward outcomes that other people would eventually benefit from. She had thought about her mother, who had co-signed the lease and walked 2 miles every morning and taken her blood pressure medication without fail and died at 57 before any of the things she had been building toward arrived. She had thought about the permission slip and signed in the backpack. She sat now at the kitchen table with Lucas across from her and the canvas bag on the floor beside her containing Harold's notebooks, which she was not prepared to put anywhere she could not reach them, and she told him about the notebook labeled 2019. She had been waiting for the right time and had understood that the right time was not when they were managing legal proceedings or media coverage or the practical logistics of a gold transfer, but when they were in the kitchen together and the city was doing its late evening thing outside the window, and there was time to actually hear it. Lucas listened with the complete attention he brought to things that mattered. He asked 2 clarifying questions. He sat with it for a moment after she finished speaking, the way he sat with mathematics problems that required more than mechanical processing, allowing the implications to assemble themselves without forcing them. He built it for other people, Lucas said. Not just for us. He built it with us as the mechanism, Maya said. The way a machine works. We're not the end point. We're the part that makes the next part possible. Lucas looked at the notebooks. He looked at the canvas bag. He looked at the kitchen light, which was still one bulb, because she had not yet replaced it, partly because the replacement had always been a luxury item in a budget that did not accommodate them, and partly because she had been managing something else entirely for 37 days, and the light bulb had continued to represent the only kind of stability she could currently reliably maintain. He got up from the table and went to the small drawer under the counter where they kept miscellaneous hardware and produced a replacement bulb, which he had apparently bought at some point and stored there without mentioning it. And he climbed on the chair and replaced the burned-out bulb, and the kitchen filled with the quality of light a fixture designed for 2 bulbs produces when both are working. She looked at him standing on the chair with the burned-out bulb in his hand, and the light doing what the fixture had always been designed to do, and she thought about Harold's 60 years, and her mother's 57, and her own 37 days, and the specific arithmetic of inherited patience, of what accumulates when people keep showing up without knowing exactly when the outcome will arrive. And she felt something in her chest that was not one thing, but several things at once. Grief for her mother who was not here, and love for her son who was in gratitude for Harold who had been patient enough for all of them. Lucas climbed off the chair and put the burned-out bulb in the recycling and sat back down. "What's the fund called?" he said. She had been thinking about this. She had a name that had come to her on the bus back from Dunmore after the first visit, the one where she had found the panel, before she had opened Harold's letter, before she had done the arithmetic, in the time when all she had was the weight of the bar in her hands and the particular feeling of a world rearranging itself. "The margin fund," she said. He considered this, because what he was building was margin. Yes, he nodded. That's right. She incorporated the Rutherford Calloway Foundation 6 weeks after the ruling, which was a longer process than she had expected, but a shorter one than it might have been without Carol's involvement in the structural planning and the advice of 2 nonprofit governance specialists she retained on Frank Alderman's recommendation. The name combined Harold's family name with her own, which was a decision she had arrived at not as a gesture of sentiment, but as a statement of what the foundation was, a continuation of something Harold had started that was now being carried under 2 names rather than one. The margin fund launched as the foundation's primary vehicle. The structure was deliberately simple. Working parents in financial crisis could apply online with minimal documentation. The fund evaluated applications within 72 hours and transferred approved amounts directly to the creditor or service provider rather than to the applicant, which eliminated the processing time that turned emergencies into catastrophes. The maximum individual grant was $2,500. There was no repayment requirement. The emergency stabilization grants were a second track. These went out in amounts between $500 and $1,500, approved within 24 hours, structured for the specific moment when a small amount changes everything. A car repair that allows someone to get to work. A utility payment that keeps the heat on in February. A dental emergency that cannot be deferred without consequences that compound. The visibility initiative took longer to build because it required partnerships, and partnerships require relationships, and relationships between a 32-year-old woman from a neighborhood the city's power infrastructure had never prioritized, and the employers and unions and municipal offices who needed to participate in order for the initiative to function require, as it turned out, the specific currency of demonstrated seriousness, which was the one currency Maya had been accumulating her entire working life. She met with the director of the city's Workforce Development Office on a Tuesday morning, in the same building where she had been doing inventory audits at the fulfillment center 2 months earlier, and she presented Harold's framework with the addition of the specific practical modifications she had developed through 5 weeks of research, which included conversations with 37 service workers she had spoken to personally in the months since the story broke, people who had approached her or whom Carol had connected her with, people who had their own variations of her experience of working invisible labor that held systems together and went unrewarded in ways that were structural rather than accidental. The director listened. He was 56, a career public servant with the weathered practicality of someone who has spent decades navigating between what is needed and what is possible. He asked questions that were genuine rather than performative. At the end of an hour, he said he was interested and wanted to bring his deputy director into the next conversation. She met with his deputy director the following week. The partnership was announced 4 months after the Foundation's incorporation, a joint initiative between the Rutherford Calloway Foundation and the city's Workforce Development Office, establishing wage standards, career pathway programs, and a recognition system for workers in the categories Harold had identified. The press release described it in language that was more formal than the language Harold had used in the notebook, but the substance was his. She hired Gerald Watts as the Foundation's historical archivist, which was not a position that had existed before she created it, and which Gerald accepted after a consideration that lasted approximately 15 seconds. He organized Harold's notebooks, the assayer certifications, the full 60 years of gold acquisition records, and the personal letters into an archive that told the story of what Harold had built and why, available to researchers and journalists, and, once the Foundation's physical space was established, to visitors who wanted to understand the particular mechanics of how a machinist in Dunmore, Pennsylvania had quietly accumulated one of the most significant private gold collections in the country without attracting a single documented moment of public attention across 6 decades. Brenda reached out 4 months after the ruling, which Maya had not expected and had not known whether to expect. The message came through Raymond Oakes, which suggested she had gone through official channels rather than personal ones, perhaps from uncertainty about whether direct contact was welcome or perhaps from the particular reserve of someone who is acknowledging a defeat and wants to do it correctly. The message was brief. Brenda wanted to donate the house to the Foundation if it could be used. She understood if it could not. She simply wanted Harold's house to be part of something that honored what he had built rather than serving as an asset she had inherited from a man she now understood she had not known. Maya had Carol draft a formal acceptance, which included an acknowledgement of the gift that named Brenda specifically, because the gift was real and deserved recognition. The house in Dunmore became the Foundation's regional office and visitor center. Gerald's archive lived there. The basement was preserved exactly as Harold had left it, the icebox restored to full external condition by a conservator who specialized in industrial antiques and who called it, without qualification, one of the most remarkable objects she had encountered in 30 years of work. The panel was demonstrable to visitors, which meant that anyone who came to the visitor center could see the mechanism, could understand the spatial discrepancy between exterior and interior dimensions, could put their own hands against the back wall and feel the place where the panel released, could understand with their bodies rather than just their minds how a thing can contain more than it appears to. The Foundation hosted a recognition ceremony for invisible workforce contributors 4 months after its first anniversary. The format was what Harold had described in the notebook: direct acknowledgement in a public forum, specific names and specific work and specific recognition rather than the general tribute that means nothing to the people it is supposed to honor. 38 people were named in the first ceremony: housekeepers, janitors, warehouse workers, home health aides, food service workers, delivery drivers, people whose labor constituted the operating infrastructure of a city that conducted its official business as though they did not exist. She stood at the podium that evening and looked at the room and thought about Hector's Diner and the Fenwick Office Plaza at midnight, and the fulfillment center on the east side of the city, and the specific quality of exhaustion that comes from working hard enough to be invisible, from having your labor be so efficiently incorporated into the functioning of things that its absence becomes the only moment at which it is acknowledged. She said, "You are not background. You are the architecture." She had written something more elaborate and had decided that morning to say this instead, because Harold had never used a word he did not need, and she was learning to apply that discipline to her own expression. The room was full and quiet. Lucas sat in the front row. He had won his regional mathematics competition, which she had watched with the specific emotion of watching someone you love do exactly what they are made to do in conditions that honor rather than diminish it. He was interested in applied mathematics, in the specific discipline of optimization, which was how Harold had thought about everything. How you extract maximum meaningful output from available resources, how you build systems that produce more than the sum of their parts. He was talking about engineering. He was talking about material science. He was talking about things that required a quality of attention she recognized, because she had been watching him apply it since he was old enough to take apart his first electronics. She was not going to tell him what to be. Harold had not told her what to find. He had built a situation in which she was free to discover what she was made for, and the distinction between being told and being free mattered more than the outcome, because the freedom was the inheritance, not the gold. The gold was just the mechanism. After the ceremony, after the guests had dispersed and the caterers had cleared and Gerald was locking up the archive, and Carol was reviewing something on her phone with the focused economy of a person whose work does not pause for events, Maya went back down to the basement alone. The icebox stood against the wall. The conservator had brought the external enamel back to something close to its original color, the deep cream white of commercial appliances from the 1940s, the particular shade that belonged to an era when things were built with a different understanding of duration. The panel was closed. The mechanism was exactly as Harold had engineered it, releasing on pressure applied at the specific point, invisible unless you were measuring, obvious once you were. She put her palm flat against the back exterior wall of the icebox. She stood there in the basement of Harold's house in the quiet of a Thursday evening in autumn, 33 years old, no longer working 3 jobs, no longer sleeping on a pull-out couch, no longer doing the arithmetic of survival on the back of grocery receipts at 3 in the morning, and she allowed herself to feel what that meant. Not in the form of celebration, which was not her register, but in the form of a full and undefended acknowledgement of the distance she had crossed and the specific cost of crossing it, and the specific people who had made the crossing possible through patience and love and the enduring decision to invest in outcomes they were not going to see. She thought about her mother walking 2 miles every morning. She thought about Harold in the basement in 1963, directing the installation with his measuring eyes, already planning something 60 years long. She thought about Gerald keeping the envelope safe for 9 months and driving 4 hours to deliver it when the time came. She thought about Carol, whose professional interest in the case had become something larger, who had reduced her fee to the minimum allowed by bar ethics, and was now serving on the Foundation's legal advisory board. She thought about Frank Alderman, retired in Pittsburgh, who had answered the phone on the second ring at 7:30 in the morning. She thought about Lucas replacing the light bulb. She pressed the mechanism and the panel released, and the interior of the concealed space was visible in the basement light. The timber shelving empty now, the bars transported and certified, and converted through a meticulous legal process into the financial foundation of something Harold had spent the latter portion of his life planning with the same patience he had applied to building it. The shelves were empty, but not bare. They had the quality of a room that has been used for its intended purpose and has now fulfilled it, the particular dignity of an instrument that has done what it was made for. She thought about the word margin. What Harold had understood, what the notebook laid out in its final pages with the blunt clarity of a man who had been thinking about it for decades, was that the absence of margin was not a personal failure. It was a design feature. The systems that organized working life at the bottom of the economic structure were designed to consume exactly the surplus that might otherwise become capital, which was to say they were designed to ensure that the people who held them up could never accumulate enough to stop holding them up. This was not a conspiracy. It did not require anyone to intend it. It simply required that no one with the capacity to change it cared enough to do so. Harold had cared. For 60 years, quietly and without fanfare, he had cared in the most practical possible way, by doing the thing that changed the outcome rather than the thing that expressed the feeling. She closed the panel. She turned off the basement light and climbed the stairs and walked through Harold's house, through the kitchen where the photograph was still on the refrigerator, the old magnet from the hardware store holding it in place, Harold and the unknown man beside the gleaming icebox, both of them carrying the particular expression of people who know what they have done and do not need to announce it. She went out the front door and stood on the porch of Harold's house in the autumn evening and looked at the 4 acres that stretched toward the county road, the pine trees standing dark against the evening sky. The quiet that was the specific quiet of rural land that has been left alone long enough to develop its own character. Gerald appeared beside her with the keys, ready to lock up. He said he would have liked tonight. She said, "I know." Gerald locked the door. They stood on the porch for a moment in the dark. He said, "What do you think he would have said if he had been in that room?" She considered this seriously because it was a serious question and Gerald was the person most qualified to ask it, having spent 50 years in the specific proximity to Harold that produced actual knowledge rather than impression. "Something brief," she said. Something that sounded like an observation and was actually a conclusion. Gerald almost smiled. Exactly like that. She drove back to the city that night, the same city she had cleaned offices in at midnight, the same city where the foreclosure notice had arrived on a Tuesday, the same city where Hector's Diner opened at 5, and the fulfillment center discouraged bathroom breaks, and the leaking ceiling in her old apartment had defeated 6 maintenance requests. The city was doing what it always did, moving with its complicated indifferent energy, which was not indifference exactly but scale, the quality of a place that contains too many lives to register any single one of them unless the single one in question does something to compel attention. Harold had never compelled attention. He had simply done the work, quietly and precisely and for 6 decades, building toward a moment he had apparently always known would arrive even when the person it was built for did not yet exist in any form he could have predicted. He had trusted the process the way he trusted his machines, understanding that if the tolerances were right and the materials were sound and the maintenance was consistent, the output would be what the design intended. She pulled into the parking lot of the apartment she now lived in, which was not the apartment with the pull-out couch and the leaking ceiling, but a different apartment in a different building, still in the same neighborhood because she had not wanted to go far, still in proximity to the geography that had shaped the last several years of her life, because she had not finished learning what it had to teach her and was not prepared to leave before the lesson was complete. Lucas was at the kitchen table when she came in. He had Harold's notebooks around him again, but different ones this time. The earlier ones, 1962 and 1963 and 1964, the years of the earliest accumulation. He had a notebook of his own open beside them, not the canvas-bound kind Harold used, but a composition notebook with a marbled cover, and he was writing something in it with the focused attention of someone who has found a thread worth following. She set her bag down and looked at what he was writing, which was a set of calculations she could not fully interpret, but which had the visual character of an engineering problem, variables and relationships rendered in the specific notation of someone who is working out a system. He looked up. He had the expression he wore when he had found something he thought she should know. "Do you know what Harold's gold was actually worth in 1961? He said, when he made the first purchase. She thought. The Bretton Woods price was fixed. $35 per troy ounce. Right. And he bought something like 15 small bars that year, based on the notebook. 15 kilograms, roughly. Worth maybe $8,000 at the time." He paused. "And now those specific bars alone are worth over $1 million. He looked at his notebook. "That's not just patience. That's a compound annual growth rate of around 8%, sustained for 60 years. He looked up. He wasn't just saving money. He was building a machine. A real one. With tolerances and yield rates and a 60-year output specification. She looked at her son at the kitchen table with Harold's notebooks around him, doing the mathematics of a thing that had already happened in order to understand how it had been built, because understanding how it had been built was the prerequisite for building the next version. She sat down across from him. "Tell me the rest," she said. He told her. He had been working through the numbers for 2 hours, and he laid out what he had found with the precision she had watched him apply to every problem that mattered to him. The long, patient accounting of a thing that looked simple from the outside because all the complexity had been absorbed into the discipline required to sustain it. She listened. The kitchen was lit by 2 working bulbs. Outside, the city moved in its scale that did not register individual lives. Harold's notebooks covered the table between them. She thought about margin. She thought about the 60 years of it that Harold had accumulated and placed in the walls of an icebox for a person he had identified by the way she organized her kitchen. She thought about what you can build when you have enough of it. When the difference between the ordinary difficulties of living and the catastrophic consequences they produce for people without margin is finally bridged, finally closed, finally rendered into something that cannot reopen. She thought about the 38 people who had stood up in the visitor center that evening while their specific names were called and their specific work was named, and the room was full of people who had come to acknowledge rather than ignore what they were looking at. She thought about Harold's voice in the notebook, precise and practical and without ornamentation. The gold is not the point. The gold is just the mechanism. Lucas finished his accounting. He set down his pen and looked at the calculation he had built across 2 pages of the composition notebook. He looked at her. "What do we build next?" he said. She looked at Harold's notebooks. She looked at her son. She looked at the kitchen light doing what 2 working bulbs were designed to do. She said, "Whatever we can reach." And she meant it the way Harold had meant everything he ever wrote down. Not as aspiration, but as specification. Not as a feeling, but as a plan. Not as a beginning, but as a continuation of something that had been running quietly for 60 years in a basement in Dunmore. Waiting with the infinite patience of metal for the moment when someone with the right kind of eyes pressed their palm against the back wall of a thing everyone else had already decided was not worth examining. The icebox had been waiting. Now the work was theirs. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them. And do not forget to subscribe if you have not already. See you in the next story. There is a particular quality of mourning that belongs only to the period directly following a life's turning point, before the new circumstances have fully normalized. When you wake up and the first few seconds carry the old orientation, the old instinct to begin calculating what the day will cost and whether you can cover it. And then the recalibration arrives and you remember. And the remembering has a different quality each time, more settled, less like a surprise, more like a fact that is, becoming part of the permanent furniture of who you are. Maya experienced this every morning for a year. She would lie in the bed, which was a real bed and not a pull-out couch, in the apartment that had 2 working light bulbs in every fixture, and she would feel the old arithmetic begin its familiar circuit and then quiet. The way a machine stops when the load it has been designed to carry is finally removed. The quiet felt, for a long time, like something she needed to keep earning, like a state that had been borrowed rather than acquired, that required ongoing justification she was not entirely certain she was providing. Harold had written about this in the notebook labeled 2019, in a passage she had read after the ruling, after the transfer, in the period when the practical management of the situation had created enough distance from the discovery that she could engage with his words without the specific static of active crisis. He had written, "The hardest part of receiving what you have earned is believing you are entitled to keep it." People who have been told their entire lives, by circumstances and systems and the specific small humiliations of poverty, that their position is the correct one, that the scarcity they inhabit is a judgment rather than a condition, do not release that message simply because the evidence contradicts it. The message is embedded. It requires not just different circumstances, but deliberate practice to rewrite. He had been thinking about her when he wrote that, or thinking about the person who would be standing where she now stood. He had understood in advance what she would feel, the way he had understood in advance that the panel would only be found by someone who measured things precisely enough to notice a discrepancy of 24 inches. She practiced believing it every day. Some days it was harder than others. On the hard days, she went to the foundation and sat in Harold's archive room, surrounded by 60 years of patient documentation, and let the numbers tell her the story again, the way the story needed to be heard to remain real. 60 years. 60 years of showing up and doing the work and not requiring acknowledgement and trusting that the right person would eventually press their palm against the right wall. She thought about her mother. She thought about her often. Sandra Calloway, who had walked 2 miles every morning and taken her blood pressure medication without fail and co-signed the lease because the numbers had seemed, if not comfortable, then at least manageable. Sandra, who had not lived to see any of this and who had not known Harold well enough to have known what he was building. Because Harold was not a man who told you things, he was a man who did them. And the doing produced its fruit at a distance that sometimes exceeded the span of a single life. She wished her mother could have known. This was the grief that did not resolve, the one that no amount of material change could address, the fundamental arithmetic of love and timing that sometimes simply does not balance. Her mother had not been there to see Lucas win the regional competition, had not been there for the ruling, had not been there for the ceremony when 38 workers stood and heard their names called in a room that was paying attention. She thought about absence as a form of presence, about the way people who are no longer there continue to organize the lives of people who love them, continue to shape decisions and instincts, and the specific quality of attention a person brings to the world. Sandra walked 2 miles every morning. Maya had started walking 2 miles every morning, not intentionally, not as tribute, but because she had found, in the period of adjustment after the 3 jobs stopped, that her body needed the movement that the 3 jobs had been providing, and that walking was the form that felt most like hers, most like the kind of movement that belonged to a person rather than to a machine. She thought about Harold and Gerald on the porch, 2 old men sharing a kind of companionship that had never required much language to function, and she thought about what it meant to have that, to have a person in proximity who knew what mattered to you without being told, who showed up and stayed without requiring gratitude or demonstration. The Foundation's 2nd anniversary arrived on a morning in November, which in the particular part of the city where Maya's new apartment sat meant leaves on the ground and the first cold that had real intention behind it, the kind of cold that was not declining summer but approaching winter, a different category of temperature entirely. She walked 2 miles in that cold before coming inside, and stood in the kitchen with both hands around a coffee cup and looked at the city through the window that now faced east, a direction her previous apartment had not offered, and watched the light establish itself over a landscape she was still learning the specific geography of. Lucas was in his 2nd year of a mathematics and engineering program at a university 40 minutes from the city, which meant he came home regularly enough that the apartment had the quality of a home occupied by 2 people rather than 1, his presence legible in the particular disorder he introduced and then corrected. The way his version of tidiness operated on a slightly different spatial logic than hers, and had since he was old enough to have opinions about where things belonged. He called on the morning of the 2nd anniversary, which was a Thursday. He called at 7:15, which was earlier than his usual calling hour, which meant he had been awake thinking about something. She picked up. He said, "I've been going through Harold's acquisition records. The ones from 1961 to 1975. She waited. He kept buying even in the years when the price dropped, Lucas said. In the early 70s, gold lost about 30% of its value over 2 years. He kept buying. He said in the notebook, price is noise. Quality and patience are not. She looked at the city through the east-facing window. The light was doing what light does in early November, arriving at an angle that was not summer's angle, lower and more deliberate, making shadows that were longer and more considered. He wasn't managing a position, Lucas said. He was building an inheritance. He always knew it was for someone else. Yes, she said. Lucas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've been working on something. An application of the same framework. Not gold specifically, a different asset class, but the same principle. He paused. I want to show you when I'm home on Sunday. She smiled, because she could hear in his voice the specific quality of someone who has found a problem that deserves their full attention and is fully giving it. The quality she had watched Harold demonstrate across 12 notebooks and 60 years of recorded precision. Show me Sunday, she said. She stood in the kitchen after the call, coffee cooling in her hands, and she thought about the word inheritance and what it actually meant and what Harold had intended when he used it. It was not the gold. She understood this completely now, in the way you understand something that has moved from the level of idea into the level of experience, which is a different and more permanent kind of knowing. The gold was the mechanism. The inheritance was this, the quality of attention that noticed a 24-inch discrepancy, the patience that built toward outcomes it would not see, the understanding that the most durable things are built for other people by people who do not require credit for building them. She had inherited that. Lucas was inheriting it now. She set down the coffee cup and picked up her jacket and went out into the November morning to walk her 2 miles in the cold light of a day that was proceeding exactly as days proceed, when the people living them have enough margin to simply live them, without the arithmetic running constantly in the background, without the calculation of what each moment costs and whether the cost can be covered. The city moved around her with its complicated and different energy. She moved through it with the quality of attention Harold had apparently recognized in her kitchen and had trusted across years of distance to be there when it was needed. It was there. It would always be there. That was the inheritance. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.